sure, but I think maybe the air conditioning.
It feels really cold in
You got
here.
good paint on there. You gotta come.
Welcome. This is the first time we get to say Multimodal Transportation Commission. So it's been a milestone getting there, and now it's hard to say. I'm not sure I really think it's that great of an idea, but
A lot of words.
we got it out the first time. Can you hear us in the back okay? Pardon me? No. Okay, well, we always have this issue, so we'll do the best we can. Okay? First item on the agenda is approval for the regular meeting minutes for October 7th, 2019. If we've all reviewed those and are comfortable with them, we could entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
Motion by John, second by Aaron. Favor, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Meetings are approved. Item 2, the general public comment. I'll read this as we normally do. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues that are not scheduled on the regular agenda. Public comment will not be received for staff items, commission items, or calendar. Each person or organization will be limited to 3 minutes. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss, debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented at this time. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in. Please state your name and address. Speakers should address all comments to the commission. Do we have any public comments? Having none, we can move on to item number 3, East 19th Street, Haskell to O'Connell design options. Our action to keep in mind is to review the alternatives and provide a recommendation to the City Commission. Hi, Dave.
Hello, good evening. Dave Cronin, City Engineer. So last month, we presented this item to Transportation Commission. I know there was a lot of questions regarding, I guess, the options that we presented, specifically not presenting an option that was less than our typical or minimum standard for a collector street, 22-foot option. So I know it had been talked about in the past. I know there was a lot of concerns in at the meeting. Last month, there was a lot of questions on that and our intent on the options that we presented. So in the after following the meeting, staff went back and reviewed the discussion at the City Commission meeting. It was May the 1st, 2018, and we had presented a presentation regarding the project and making the connection to O'Connell and all of the benefits for going forward with the project. And at the meeting, there was some presentations and some discussion about a streets.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dave. Why don't you folks move to the front? Just come on up here to the
Can
front
you not
row.
hear me?
We're the only ones having trouble hearing.
Well, you probably are not, but you'll hear, you got a better chance of hearing up here.
I will try to speak into the microphone more.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dave.
Yep, no problem. Is this better? Okay. All right. So Steph went back and we reviewed the meeting and the meeting minutes from when we made the presentation. And again, I know there was some requests to consider that option, but it was, I believe, the direction that we received following the discussion was to include 31-foot option as the minimum width, and that was specifically in the commission's motion at the meeting. And at that meeting, we were getting direction on issuing an RFQ for consultant services to design the project. And so we issued that RFQ with those directions. I would point out, as I pointed out in the meeting last month, that they also specifically gave us direction to include a bicycle facility that was separated from vehicular and pedestrian traffic. And so that was also included in the RFQ, and we issued it. At the February 5th meeting is when staff brought the engineering contract to the City Commission. That scope included the 5 different design options and recommended hiring BG Consultants to proceed with the design. And so we've proceeded in that direction with providing the 5 different design options. I know at the last meeting, we had a question on should the commission be providing just feedback on options or a recommendation. And so it's, we believe it's your purview to provide us a recommendation. The recommendation can differ from staff's recommendation. And so in addition to feedback, feedback's good, you may provide a recommendation on this agenda item. I think we also had some questions regarding city standards. I've included some information in the memo on that the city design criteria, standard details, and specifications are maintained by the city engineer. They're not adopted by ordinance, and there's not an official waiver or appeal process. These standards are reviewed annually. We send them out to our partners in the community that we work with to get feedback as new technologies emerge, specs, standards get revised from year to year. So we go through a process, make appropriate additions or modifications to those criteria, and then we publish those, and they're usually used. It generally occurs in the first of the year, and it's an annual update. In addition, I think on the second page of the memo, I did add some more information regarding our new Lawrence Bikes plan and how the anticipated posted speed limit, which I would say would be 30 miles per hour, which would be consistent with the rest of 19th Street, and the existing ADT just west of Harper, what level of comfort that would provide us. And so if there's any real detailed questions on that, I think Jessica would be happy to help answer those. But generally speaking, our goal is to achieve a level of comfort 3 or below. And so I've provided here a list of the level of comfort with the different types of bike facilities. So as you get to a lower number, the higher level of comfort you would have. So 3 down to a 2 down to a 1 would be a 1 would be better than a 3. With that being said, I guess I would like to walk through the options again and ask Jason with BG to come up and kind of walk through those 5 different design options again. Get any questions that you had. I also had him put together a recommendation, a letter that's attached to the agenda as well. And then if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jason Hoskinson, engineer with BG Consultants here in town. I'm going to scroll down here and just highlight the 5 concept options. I'm not going to get quite down into the weeds that we got into last month. I think we had a good, healthy discussion. It's down here somewhere. Here we go. So I'll highlight the overview of the 5 concepts that we looked at, and then I'll come back to some discussion that we've had with city staff since the October commission meeting and talk a little bit about recommendation that we have. So as Dave mentioned, we looked at 5 concepts, and these were presented last month. Concept 1 that you see there is the 47-foot wide 3-lane street with on-street bicycle facilities. This is essentially the match to Venture Park. This is what I think when city staff first started the process, they were sort of envisioning this corridor from Harper to Harper to O'Connell Road to Venture Park would look like something like this. After some of the feedback they received from the city commission, we realized they wanted to look at something smaller down to, say, a 31-foot street. So we did look at 4 more options for a smaller or narrower street width. Concept 2, as Dave mentioned, is the city's minimum design standard for collector streets. So you got a 31-foot wide street with sidewalks on the side, in this case, behind the curb. In this case, bicyclists would be sharing the road with motorists. So kind of a Sharrow type of installation or something similar to that. Concept 3 expands on that and says, well, let's provide a on-street but separated bike lanes for the facility. So you can see concept 3, 37-foot wide street, two-lane street with on-street bike lanes and 2 5-foot sidewalks behind the curb. Concepts 4 and 5 then take into account facilities that are off the street for bicyclists. I know there was several commissioners that were definitely, city commissioners that were definitely interested in some type of separated facility. Concept 4 and 5 both are looking at a minimum design standard, 31-foot wide street. Concept 4 incorporates a cycle track option where we would have a separated facility for head-to-head traffic on one side of the street. Whereas Concept 5, we keep 2 smaller separated facilities, but they're above and behind, back behind the curb. And again, we've got some graphics in there. I could go into that in more details if you would like. But after the discussion that we had last month, really felt like this commission was definitely interested in a narrower street with some off-street facilities for bicyclists. As Dave mentioned, there were a number of questions, and city staff and BG, we got together, had a lot of discussion with different internal agencies. And now I'm going to scroll up to my memo to the commission for this month. Okay. So we've broken this out into the 19th Street reconstruction recommendation and then the intersection of 19th and Harper. I'll get to that in just a minute, but focusing primarily on the 19th Street reconstruction. Again, Harper to Venture Park. We are recommending a 31-foot wide street with the separated bicycle facility in the form of a cycle track on one side of the road. And I've listed a number of bullet points there as to why we've come to that recommendation. You know, keep in mind, as we design as engineers, we're looking to uphold the public health, safety, and welfare, and we've got to take into account all the different users, not just the motorists, not just the bicyclists. We got to weigh all of those different users and needs on the corridor and come to what we believe is the best and safest solution for the corridor. In this instance, we're providing a 19th Street which matches similar facilities between Massachusetts and Harper Street. So we are meeting drivers' expectations, providing a similar driving experience. They know what to expect. Staff conversations with fire and med, you know, keep in mind, if we went something narrower than a 31-foot wide street, it really restricts their ability to do what they need to do to respond to emergencies. If there's a stalled vehicle or a police officer pulls someone over, if we're down to, say, a 2-lane street, it really hampers and limits their ability to respond to emergencies and handle calls. Another bullet point there I mentioned, this is compliant with the city's current minimum design standards, and we believe it's, there's some opportunities with this option to provide some traffic calming and a better design. We did also include the recommendation for a cycle track versus the elevated bike lanes, simply based on a maintenance perspective. In dealing with, or in talking with city staff, maintenance staff, they believe it's going to be hard, if not difficult, to impossible to try to maintain those elevated bike lanes on the sides of the street. You know, when they go through and push snow or whatever, all the snow is going to get pushed onto those bike lanes. They don't really have a way to clear them off. With a cycle track, however, they can clear it off similar to like the shared use paths, multi-use paths, rec trails, things like that around town. So they have equipment to handle that. They don't really have the equipment. They're not really set up and geared towards the elevated bike lane option. So based on those ideas, thoughts, discussions, that's why we're recommending the concept number 4 for the 19th Street reconstruction. And then I'd be happy to answer questions with that. Let me real quick talk about the intersection, 19th Street and Harper Street intersection configuration. We also talked about this last month in the concept design summary, looking at either keeping it as an all-way stop or converting it to a single-lane roundabout. And prior studies as well as our study all confirmed that very adequate levels of service are going to be obtained with a all-way stop configuration at this location. And this also presents an opportunity in that fashion for us to accomplish that cycle track conversion where we go from on-street bike lanes to a cycle track through the corridor. So with that said, we don't see a immediate need or a near-term future need to change the intersection from how it's currently operating. So we're recommending we leave it as an always stop controlled intersection, and during the design phase, we'll look at PROAG ADA compliant improvements and some other things that may need to take place with that. So that in a nutshell is, I think, what we wanted to present tonight and bring back to the commission to try to answer your questions and help with the discussion that we had last month. With that said, I'll turn it back to you. If you have any questions of me, I'd be happy to answer those. Otherwise, I'll sit down and come back when we have some more discussion.
Thanks, Jason. Let's ask any particular specific questions for Jason now. I do want to hear from the public before we get into a lot of discussion here. So let's kind of limit this to any kind of clarification or questions you might have about the design.
Yes, ma'am.
Simple one. By Kennedy School, what are you doing as far as providing children to cross 19th Street?
So that would be handled at the 19th and Harper intersection. It is a safe route to school. It is mapped out as a safe route to school. And what we would be doing in the always stop controlled configuration, we'd be realigning the crosswalks, remarking, restriping the intersection. Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's also a crossing guard there right now at that intersection as well. So we're not planning any major improvements other than better alignments, better accessibility, and improved markings at that location.
Nick, anything?
Yeah, so, can everybody hear me okay? All right, so it sounds like then the impetus for keeping with 31-foot width design is not necessarily city standard, but more because of the concern over emergency services?
That's part of it, yeah. We're
Okay.
taking into account all potential needs and uses of the corridor. Certainly, for example, there was some discussion about two 11-foot lanes last time, 22-foot. Yeah, you can carry two lanes of travel in a 22-foot corridor, but it doesn't allow emergency services to do what they need to do safely and respond in a timely fashion.
So I just looked up how wide a ladder truck is. It's 8 feet wide. It sounds like if only one lane was stalled, they could still get around. It seems highly unlikely that 2 lanes will be stalled, and with the completed grid system, they couldn't still get around. So I guess I'm wondering if that's truly a deal breaker or just kind of a small factor. It sounded to me the way it was presented in the memo that it was a major factor, but I mean, that doesn't seem to stop people in New York or Philly from getting to fires. So I'm just curious.
There are also, go ahead. Yeah.
So I had our Fire Marshal Chris King give me the verbatim from the fire code, and it's the access road with a hydrant. So if you have the hydrants on the street, which we would anticipate having the hydrants on the street with this project, where a fire hydrant is located on a fire apparatus access road, the minimum road width shall be 26 feet exclusive of shoulders, and that is D103.1.
Is
So
this,
that would be their,
so is that a national
minimum.
code?
yes.
Because a lot of cities are going to be out of compliance with that. That sounds like, I
There's-
mean, and they haven't burned down yet. So it seems like that's like a to the future kind of thing. It'd be nice if we all had this amount of room, but realistically, I mean, there's a lot of streets that are less than 26 from fire hydrant to fire hydrant. So, and they're not
There
even on grid systems necessarily. So, I mean, are these guidelines that if you don't do it, you go to jail, or are these just recommendations by the fire department of what they would like to see?
Well, I believe we have adopted the fire code, and they follow the guidelines in that.
So what did they do on residential streets? Because collector roads have to be more than 31 feet wide, right, at a minimum? But what about residentials, which are smaller?
Our residential street standards are 27-foot back-to-back, so you would have 26 feet inside face of curb to face of curb, so that would meet their requirement.
So is all of North Lawrence out of compliance then? And is there plans to eventually widen the street? It just seems to me that like, it's a little bit arbitrary given that there are currently functioning streets that have fire hydrants and fire trucks get through. I mean, I'm not a fire protection expert, but this has come up in other cities as well, where everything else seems to fall into place, but then the fire chief says, well, NFPA, I'm bound by NFPA. Only if you adopt it. I mean, you can still get around otherwise, I don't know. I guess it's, to me as an engineer, there's a difference between like a law you have to actually uphold, like an EPA regulation, and recommended standards. And it seems like the recommended standards have room for wiggle, as it were. I don't know. Anybody else have, or am I just going nuts here?
Well,
I'd like to make sure I understand. You're saying when there's a need to access a fire hydrant, then 26 feet is the recommendation?
Correct,
All
as
right.
the minimum width.
And that
they
road has a
can-
fire hydrant they would need to access?
That they can set up next to a fire, adjacent to a fire hydrant.
Does that road have a fire hydrant?
Right now,
Yeah.
I can't confirm. I think it does, but
So what is the requirement without a fire hydrant?
I believe it's 22 feet, 22 or 24 feet.
Let's say with that being a main street, 12-inch line, that
Yeah,
will
but
have
they're
fire
not
hydrants
always
on
on
it
the
along the
street.
corridor
For sure.
Yeah, I mean,
at the appropriate spacing.
we're definitely putting them on the street.
Yes.
Whether they're
Oh, yeah.
now, and whether they face the street now, I don't know. I know there's some out there, but I don't know if they face the street, but.
Wouldn't the bike lanes function
It's
as
20
a
feet.
shoulder if we had narrow streets?
Can you repeat the question?
Wouldn't the bike lanes function as a shoulder for emergencies?
Yes, that would be width that they could use. If, with the on-street bike lane, that would be inclusive of that width. And regarding the question on width without, the fire hydrant's 20 feet, 20 feet. So there's some access drives. You normally see that more internally on sites, where if you're putting an access drive around a building to be able to fight a fire on the other side of the building, you have a minimum 20 feet.
further questions?
Yeah.
Nope. Ron?
I want to do a quick clarification also on the elevated bike lanes. Is that the one you were saying they can't maintain properly with snow? Or was it the on-street bike lanes? I'm not sure I got that right.
The elevated,
Okay.
because there would be some, call it sort of a barrier, if you will. Curbs along the edge there, drainage maintenance, things like that. Drainage structures along there between that and between the driving lanes and the bike lanes that are elevated above there. So from a maintenance standpoint, I don't know that they have any equipment I'm sure there's probably some equipment they could purchase out there somewhere, but
So how is the shared use pathway on Clinton Parkway maintained? Because that is it's about a 10-foot track, right?
Mm-hmm.
With a curb in between it and the street.
Yeah.
So,
Some of them they use, there's gator
Right.
type equipment, and a lot of them they use smaller pickup trucks to plow them. I think the concern with this from our maintenance folks was if you have a large snow and you're piling it up you're piling it right there versus, now, some of them we have close to the back of the curb, but it's not an ideal situation, but it's not like you have a 5-foot area that's where all the snow's going, and then being able to get up on that area, that 5-foot area, to plow snow then off of that with a piece of equipment is their concern, and
okay. So you can't use like one of the curb cuts to go up in there, so you don't have to go over snow bank? I mean, it looks like there's green space on this particular profile here, concept 4. There's no scale, but it seems to be 4 to 5 feet wide. So, I mean, that's not a very big snowbank, but how wide is the setback on the Clinton Parkway shared use path?
I believe it's around 2 feet.
yeah.
Seems pretty similar of a geometry then.
Well, the elevated bike lanes are right behind the curb. I think it's the option,
I'm looking at the wrong option.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
yeah,
Four
concept
or
5
Oh,
is
yeah, sorry.
elevated, it would be
It's-
on.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
I was looking at 4. Okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
5 is
Nope.
the issue. Okay, so,
4 is what we're recommending.
right, so track and bike lane are not the same thing. Sorry. Pardon me? That makes sense.
I was going to ask, drilling down a little bit from what Nick said, but other than the emergency vehicle access and circulation, do you see any other driving disadvantages to a smaller width? Anybody?
Well, I mean, we need two lanes of two
Yeah.
lanes for motorized vehicles. I think some of it boils down to city policies, city codes, city design parameters at the time being. And then, as he mentioned, the NFPA, the codes there. If you don't comply, there's a lot of infrastructure out there that doesn't comply with current day design standards. We all know that. It's grandfathered in. It is what it is. When you go to improve it, though, you need to try to achieve, as best you can, compliance with those design standards to put yourself in the best position to avoid some kind of liability in the future. And, I can't speak to the legal side of liability if you go smaller or how you go about doing that. But again, we try to, as engineers, take all of these different users and potential uses of the corridor and come up with the best solution we see fit to accomplish all of those.
Okay,
I would add, the one thing I would also add is that we're building it for more than just vehicular lanes, and we have transit that we expect to operate on this facility and to be able to provide them room to operate, not be in a narrow lane, is important as well. As long as, we mentioned fire setting up, but as we have other emergency first responders, police, to pulling, making stops on the street that have adequate room on a street that's more highly traveled than a residential street. And
Right.
I think all of those factors and driver expectations on this sort of street, a collector street, is why we believe that we should stick with a 31-foot minimum width. And it also gives us flexibility in the future, whether it's having room for on-street parking, whether it's permanent or temporary, or whatever else. There's more flexibility as we've, west of Harper, the 31-foot street in the past may have had parking, and then we removed it and put in bike lanes. So it gives us more flexibility as well, at least some flexibility. So for all those reasons, I think that's, in addition, why we feel 31-foot, sticking with our standard is important.
okay. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We can move on to public comment. Please come up and sign in. Let us know your name and address. And are we going to run the clock tonight, Dave?
3 minutes.
We have a 3-minute limit, and please be as concise as you can.
Good evening, Commissioners, Chairman Evans. My name is Michael Allman, Brook Creek Neighborhood. We are a member of the 19th Street Neighborhoods Coalition, which has from day one been requesting that the street be kept at the 22-foot width that it functions very well right now. And I would like you to consider how staff is saying that it's 31 feet back of curb to back of curb west of Harbor, which is true, which is a 30-foot street. And so they want to maintain 31-foot back of curb east of Harbor. Like there's some sort of internal logic there. If you consider west of Harbor, there are 4.5-foot wide bicycle lanes. That leaves 22 feet between the bicycle lanes for motor vehicle traffic, 22 feet. Functions very fine. If traffic is on west of Harbor and they then reach the intersection and continue east of Harbor and the street all of a sudden opens up to 31 feet, that's an invitation, for more volume, more speed. You're going from a 22-foot wide motor vehicle lanes to 31 feet. If we consider what's happening on East 23rd Street, they are narrowing the lanes to 11 feet for traffic calming and volume control. We're asking for the same be done on east of Harper Street on 19th Street. When the RFQ was issued in, I think it was July of 2018, I set up a meeting with Mr. Souls because at that city commission meeting in in July, there were any number of indications, as I mentioned last month, that a 22-foot wide option would be considered in the RFQ. I won't enumerate all the times that we were promised that. But in my meeting with Mr. Souls, we talked a lot about the 22-foot wide option, and it would allow 9 extra feet more than the 31-foot option to the side for utilities, for green space, for trees, for sidewalks, whatever. If you have a 31-foot wide street, you take up a lot of that right-of-way. But nevertheless, the conclusion of that meeting, Mr. Souls, and this is only, I was there, the only person there, but he did promise me, and I was reassured. As with Castle Avenue, we just want to do what the community wants. I was reassured when I heard that. I thought the RFQ would include the 22-foot wide option. Well, it didn't. So once again, we're back here saying, what's going on? Why are we not hearing a 22-foot wide option? Last month, Chair Evans at the end of the meeting said, are we to expect a 22-foot wide option to come back to us next month, today? 7 of the 9 commissioners last month expressed interest in that 22-foot wide option. Where's the concept? The concept, not a design. We should be looking at the concept tonight, laid out in what the parameters may or may not be. That's all I'm saying about the 22-foot wide option, and my time has run out. But I wanted to emphasize, we still do want to have our open drainage. It's not something to be considered in transportation, but it should be because it affects how the neighborhood streets are livable from flood control, green space, and things like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
It's okay. It's all right. I'm a teacher. When technology fails, you move on. Thank you. My name is Ali Phillips. I've presented in front of this commission, as well as many other public forums multiple times on this issue, so thank you for hearing me again. I am part of the 19th Street Coalition. I live in University Place neighborhood, just 1.5 blocks north of Lawrence High School. My kids went to Cordley School. We've been walking 19th Street since they were 5 years old. One is now a freshman at KU, and the other is a junior in high school, so we know that traffic and that street very well. I'm here to again remind you about transparency and accountability in the process. I think that's what makes communities strong, when the public has a right to be part of the process and share their thoughts and views, and then more importantly, when city staff and commissioners and people like you hear us and take our thoughts seriously. What I was going to show you was kind of piggybacking off of what Michael said. The evening started talking about a transcript of the City Commission meeting in May of 2018 when the RFP was decided. I have the transcript on my iPad with highlighted notes of July City Commission meeting on July 17th, 2018. And some of the parts through that transcript that I've highlighted just really emphasize, as Michael said, the innumerable times that the neighborhoods were told they would be part of this process and that their design options would be heard. I had so many quotes from Mr. Sewell's, quote, 22 feet, if that's an option, we will discuss that. Another quote, when we're starting to design, we'll look at all the different options, we'll include the neighborhoods, we'll get all the options through the design work, we'll work with the neighborhoods, all of the design options, we'll provide all the options with the neighborhoods, see what the neighborhood wants to do. If the 22-foot option is what the neighborhood wants, we'll present that too. These are all direct quotes directly from that transcript. So it's frustrating to feel like, you're working really hard for years to try to get people who are responsible for making major decisions that impact the neighborhoods that we have chosen to live in, to raise our kids in, to walk on every day. I won't even bring up the fact that 19th Street is, I don't know, I'm not out of touch anymore with this, the city's designated safe route to school for Cordley. And when my boys were little, we chose to walk them in the street on 18th Street with 0 sidewalks because it was actually safer than walking our kids on 19th Street. So I've been an advocate for this for a really long time. I'm asking that you consider all the options in front of you, and I guess not in front of you, but supposed to be in front of you, to minimize increased traffic along 19th Street. And it's not just all of 19th Street. We're talking about a very short strip of 19th Street that cannot be expanded into a wider thoroughfare really any further west of that intersection at Harper. So it just doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't make sense for the neighbors. It really doesn't make sense, honestly, in my opinion, for anything other than potential inhabitants of Venture Park. And I hope you put the priority on the families and the neighbors and the kids who have made that their home for decades. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Sharon Ashworth, and I live in University Place neighborhood. I'm a neighbor of Elise, and I'd like to reiterate some of the points she made, but also just talk about, both Michael and Lee talked about neighborhoods. There's a neighborhood coalition that is working with this, and I want to emphasize that this is really a neighborhood street. It goes by several neighborhoods, 3 schools, and what we're looking at here is mostly a residential road going past 3 schools, and in Plan 2040, which will be adopted shortly by the city and the county, we are looking for walkable, livable neighborhoods. And by keeping a street narrow with bicycle and pedestrian facilities on either side, we accomplish that vision. What I see now in most of the plans for this, for widening that street, is a street that emphasizes car traffic. We've got a street that does that. It's 23rd Street. It is built for that kind of traffic in and out of Venture Park, bypassing Venture Park. 19th Street is a neighborhood street, and if you take the vision of what Plan 2040 is asking the city to accomplish, we're talking about walkable, livable neighborhoods. And the narrower street, the bicycle and pedestrian facilities accomplishes that vision. So I'd like you to remind you of where the city is going with Plan 2040 and help make that vision come true by keeping that 19th Street as a walkable, livable neighborhood street. So thank you.
Thanks. Still open for further public comment? Anyone?
I'm Bonnie Effman. I live in the Barker neighborhood. I'm having trouble understanding what I'm hearing and what I'm not hearing tonight. I thought very clearly I had heard the City Commission in the past and the Transportation Commission request that one of the options to be considered is a 22-foot option. And I couldn't hear very well, and I certainly couldn't read what was up there, but I didn't hear that being presented this evening, and I am at a loss as to how that is possible. I hope that you are here, and I would hope that city staff would be here to hear the wants of the neighborhood, and we have expressed that repeatedly. And this does not seem to pay any attention to anything we've been saying. To me, the width of the street is of primary importance. It doesn't make sense to me to have a big, wide, fancy street as an invitation, okay, let's move in more faster traffic, when there's no place for it to go. It's still a neighborhood street. That concerns me a lot. It also, I am astounded at the suggestion that 23rd Street should have 22-foot, should be narrowed to 22 feet. And yet our 22-foot street should be widened. My understanding is that 23rd Street is the main thoroughfare, not 19th, and none of this is making sense to me. I appreciate you listening, and I hope that we can get down to where there is a 22-foot option being considered. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Hi, my name is Judah Lewis, and I live in the Barker neighborhood, and I just want to support what all my neighbors have said. So.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Yeah, my name's Melissa Warren, and I live at 337 Johnson, which is about a half a block north of 19th Street on Leonard. And it makes no sense to me to have a wider street funnel down to the existing width of 19th Street. It's going to, it could invite trucks to come down that way, which we definitely don't need. There's already too much traffic on the central part of 19th Street between Haskell and Campus. It's overcrowded now, and there's I live there, I can see it, the street from my back porch, and there's a speeding problem along there. We just don't need more traffic or larger vehicles being potentially funneled down into that narrow street that we have, and those little roundabouts that were probably designed for a smaller amount of traffic than what they're carrying, like the one at 19th and Barker is getting really busy. I mean, at certain times of day, it's almost blocking up. I don't know. I drive by there a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Julia Thomas. I live in the Barker neighborhood. I just want to say that I'm against anything that encourages more traffic on 19th Street. I think it's busy enough. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else hopping up here. Just curious, how many folks out in the audience who haven't spoken are here to support that position? A couple up here. Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, it's back up here, and I normally, over the last several months, have gone around the table before I start, but I think tonight I'd like to just get my own 2 cents in here and get a critique from everybody after I do that. And I think I'll start out by saying I have probably a little more engineer in my genetics than not. And I struggle with that. And, you know, being an architect for 30 years causes you to respect engineering standards. And if you don't, you can get in a lot of trouble for that. However, I don't think that's where the discussion stops. I do think it's our responsibility to move beyond that. And the way I'm able to do that is not by just accepting an engineering standard and moving on, but I try to put myself in the actual experience mode, i.e. driving on streets that are 22 feet, driving on streets that are 31 feet, and trying to feel how I feel, or trying to figure out how I feel. Still struggling with that DNA that I have in me that's pretty much an engineer. So I basically went out in the last several days. I live in North Lawrence, and I know people that don't live in North Lawrence don't drive there often, but there are plenty of 22-foot wide streets. And I happen to live on one. And I can tell you that I am uncomfortable. I want to make one other point that I forgot early on. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not sitting here saying this is representing a whole bunch of other people that are sure going to agree with me. I'm not saying that at all. I think that's really up to others to decide whether they agree with me, add to it, or not. But I can tell you when I drive on a 22-foot wide street, which I do every day, I get very uncomfortable with trucks. There's a lot of trucks, there's a lot of vans, there's a lot of small buses that are aiming at me coming up that street. And not all the time, but sometimes, depending on how fast they're going and how big the vehicle is, I literally stop. Yeah, that's my experience. I'm like, gee, I'm not going to mess with this at all. I'm just going to stop and let this vehicle go by and move on. So I'm saying that I have a little discomfort in a 22-foot wide street for that reason. And people are going to be driving. I totally respect the idea in 2040 about, the livability of this town, and we really need to keep that in focus. But we are going to be driving here for a while too, and we want to be doing that safely. So it's probably a lot of words to say, I just don't think I'm totally comfortable with a 22-foot wide street in this location. Medical vehicles, vans, buses, whatever. Now, my experience with a 31-foot wide street is I don't see much of a deterrent on a 31-foot wide street for people to slow down. I've driven up 19th Street, not as long as Ali has, but enough to know that unless you have a bike lane there, it seems pretty wide and people go pretty fast, just generally. There are going to be bad players out there. They're going to speed and do stupid things anywhere they are. But I do think that 31 feet is not acting much of a deterrent to slow people down. And listening to the neighborhood for a year and a half now, and the experiences, I think for us to act responsibly, we should consider something less than 31 feet. I'm not going to put a number out there. Somewhere in between. I would trust that BG and Dave and Chuck, if people are open to getting outside of a city standard, would want to look at something less than 31 feet and look at it from a practical engineering perspective. So I think that's where I land on this, is, trying to be diplomatic about it, but realistic in terms of how I experience personally driving in Lawrence. Something than less than 31 would make a lot of sense. I think we should consider a recommendation. Honestly, I'm not too worried about seeing a drawing that has a dimension on it. I just don't think there may be an argument for that being a more powerful statement, to see that. But personally, I think where we are now, if there's a consideration to get outside of a design standard, then we ought to say, let's look at that. And I think we ought to make sure, I know you guys will be at the city commission meeting when this all occurs. And, from my perspective, and there's 9 other people up here that get to chime in here, but that's how I feel. So, I'd sure like to hear what other people feel.
Well, I think the standard that ambulance or fire and medical have talked about, the 26-foot, I have a hard time, I understand the grandfathering in of narrower streets in the neighborhoods and what exists in North Lawrence and all of that. But when I think about building something new, and if we've got a standard, trying to follow the standard as much as possible. But for this small stretch, is it possible to look at the 26-foot width? I mean, I think as a starting point, maybe just so that we know that ambulances and fire trucks, and I am concerned about bus traffic. There are plenty of streets that the buses have a terrible time navigating now. So I'd hate to build something that they can't navigate, or is there also consideration for lower speed limits? Do we have to go with 30 miles an hour? I mean, I don't know if there's a standard that says if it's this wide, you have to go this fast, and we know that people are going to speed, but is there a way, I thought we had talked about a trend towards maybe lowering, just in general in the city of Lawrence, lowering speed limits, that possibly 19th Street could be, have a lower speed limit.
Yeah, I would say we are looking at lowering the speed limits lower than 30, primarily on residential streets. On collector streets, 30 miles per hour is a pretty low speed limit. I think we would probably vary between 30 and 40 around town on collector-type streets. But also point out, to help regulate some of the speed on the street, I think, have a recommendation to put in a raised crosswalk or a speed cushion to help slow traffic. We've heard the concerns about speed and volume. Sometimes they kind of go hand in hand. The more volume you have, the less speed traffic goes at because of the restriction of the amount of volume. So as you get towards 19th Street to the west around Lawrence High, it's pretty slow, but the volume's high. And so I think I understand. I guess, the concern about the width of the street and having higher speeds. If the volume's not going to be very high, you're going to have more opportunity to go fast, and you need to have some controls in the design that help regulate the speed, because enforcement, as we've discussed round and around, isn't there 24/7, and so the opportunity to put in a traffic calming in that block would certainly help, in our opinion. So, and I would, and I would go back where I started in saying that this group can make a recommendation that's less than our city standard, but.
And then it'll be up to the commission?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody? Aaron?
I feel like this is a bit of a conundrum, because I do think we have standards and we have them for a reason, but I also think that doesn't mean our standards are always good. It's like anything else. It's like laws that we've had in the past that aren't necessarily just or good, and they can change. And I look at our comprehensive plan and what we aspire to be. I'm just going to kind of go through my notes for what we just discussed. So what we aspire to be, what we often say is we want to be multimodal, safe for all, slow speeds, because this is a safety issue. And so one thing I always think about is maybe we would need those fire trucks and emergency services less if the speed limits were slower. That's an interesting dynamic. And we're talking about emergency services, so I was just reading something on traffic fatalities outnumber fire fatalities 10-1, but fire trucks also respond to traffic fatalities, so it's kind of moot. But so I feel like this is constantly in conflict, but I hear us say so often, here's what we want. We want to be multimodal. We want to be this. And then when we'll talk about things we're doing, like whether we're putting in another roundabout, we'll say, well, Olathe is doing it or Lenexa is doing it. And I always say, but aren't we trying to say we don't want to be Olathe and Lenexa? So it always goes back to what we aspire to in Plan 2040. I know that Plan 2040 is a collector road, and so then you go back to what our what a collector road calls for, a 31-foot road. I would be thrilled if my road were 22 feet, but it's a modern suburban street, so it's 27. And it always has a nice speed limit when cars are parked on either side. So every time there's construction in our neighborhoods, everyone slows down. So also, when Castle was being considered for reconstruction, I remember lots of people showing up and complaining about the decreasing in the road width. By the end, I felt like people were showing up and supporting it. Once there was some education, people were showing up and supporting it. What I see in this is everybody that's showing up to this meeting is calling for a narrower road width. And we can recommend a different option than our standards. So hold on a second. Our policies have been built with cars in mind, and that includes emergency responses. So if you look around the country at other cities that may not have sort of a suburban build, they are able to come up with some other alternatives. I understand we don't have any of this, but some people use very different fire trucks that maneuver very differently, and they're able to do that. or go over curbs. I mean, you can't always do that in a place like New York, but in a place like Lawrence, Kansas, where there's typically a big, huge green space on one side, that is an option. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to mention is, so we're talking about, you know, when you go and update someplace like North Lawrence, then you build it to whatever the standard is. So we're going to build all streets now that are 22 feet to be 31 foot or 27 feet in the case of residential. And is that really improving what we have? And I don't think it is. I think the problem with those standards is those standards are the standards that we have now seen Lawrence sort of get to through suburbanization. And that's the kind of thing that I think we've been trying to reverse. So does it make sense to now take those standards and make everything 27 feet in residential? And I will guarantee you can go 40 miles an hour down my road because I've seen it done. And so on a 40 mile an hour, 45 mile an hour car going 45 mile an hour, hits somebody, an adult, 95% of the time they'll die. And going 20 miles an hour, it's 95% of the time they'll live. So if you think about the speeds and how they impact people walking on those roads. Now, I think because this stretch of road is far enough from sort of the major area where people are walking, and I do think last time we had a discussion about there are already the links there. There are already roads there. People are going to use it much the same way it's used now. So is it really going to increase traffic a lot? I don't know. But I also think you have to start somewhere. We can't just keep talking about it and say, but we're going to keep doing this because this is what we've done for 40 years. At some point, you just have to say, okay, but this is what we're going to try and step back from suburban roads. So I think I'd like to see a 22-foot option.
Carol?
I have a few thoughts here. First off, our complete streets policy, I think we need to add to it for retrofitting in old neighborhoods. You can't make an old neighborhood new. It just doesn't work. Putting a suburban street in an urban setting, some neighborhood that's really aged. I know from the experiences in our neighborhood that when a street is improved, at least we say it's improved, it makes it worse for everybody else. It makes it worse for cyclists, it makes it worse for pedestrians. And the drivers, you get more of them and they drive faster. I'm going to bring it up. I don't think we're ready to connect to O'Connell. We're not talking about a grid system because just on the other side, at the end there is no grid system. We're asking the neighborhood to start the grid system. And I think that's quite a heavy load from the industrial park to expect the neighborhood to accommodate it. I think the industrial park needs to work on its street system. A little bit north of that, there's no street system, so there's no real reason to connect at this time. I think if we improve, no, we're not going to improve. We're going to fix the road that we have now. Then we need to wait and see what happens next. If we need emergency vehicles to get to the industrial park, let them jump the curb. They can do that. That's where I'm at.
Who's next?
I can go if you want.
Okay.
You ready?
Sure.
All right. There we go. All right. So here's where I'm sitting at this point. I think there are a lot of acceptable reasons for not giving the 22-foot wide concept as we kind of discussed in the last meeting. And that would be, if there's truly no room left in the budget for change orders, I understand that, been there, done that. As a consultant, sometimes there's really no money for it. It sucks. NFPA, if NFPA is going to pull our fire department's accreditation or certification if we don't conform, yeah, that's a pretty good reason. If there's truly a need for 11+ foot wide trucks like crawler cranes to drive on the street all the time, yeah, fair enough. They can drive on it once or twice a day and still get by. If the city commission is truly not okay with anything narrower than 31 feet, that's a reasonable reason as well. And finally, if the street design standards are truly adopted ordinance, which now we know they're not. So what's not acceptable, I think, in my mind at least, is standards that we don't want to deviate from. So as an engineer, standards are important, and they're generally kind of a time saver based on research, experience. They're built over time, they evolve over time. So for example, a lot of of civil, environmental, mechanical engineering firms have standard specs for how they deal with submitted drawings, valve types, piping colors. And these are built on experience. These are built on what clients have previously desired, what's worked, what's been easiest to install, what's cheapest, which vendor we like to work with, et cetera. But if the client wants something different, we generally will conform to their desire. If for whatever reason Sioux City, Iowa does not want brown sludge piping, if they don't like brown, fine, we'll make it maroon, fine. As long as it doesn't break a law, we're okay with that usually. And if we have a paper trail. An example of a standard that's been inappropriately applied over the years are so back in the 50s or 60s, Ford and GM did some studies of how long it takes a highway driving vehicle once they leave the highway to come to kind of a natural stop. It's about 30 to 40 feet. And they said, well, that's a pretty good amount of width then to make outside of highways so nobody gets hurt if they fall off the road. Great. But then it started getting applied to non-freeway roads. Things got really wide really quick, which then kind of compounded the problem by making these really wide streets that are visually very easy to drive very fast on. So not all standards can fit all contexts all the time, is kind of what I'm getting to. So another thing that came up that I thought was interesting, professional engineers' objective is to uphold the safety and welfare of the public. That's kind of in our creed, right? A wide street is the exact opposite of that. So it's worse for both pedestrians and cyclists. It's worse for drivers because if they drive faster and they get in an accident, a 35-mile-an-hour accident versus a 20-mile-an-hour accident is significantly more costly for both your health and your car. Emergency services can still get by just fine. Like I said, in Philadelphia and New York, they somehow find a way to not burn the city down, and they have the exact same fire trucks as we do. So if that's the reason, I'm going to call the fire department on that, because that is not a problem. So what are the implications, I guess, of it sounds like it comes back to 19th Street as a collector street. This is our design standards for collector streets. I'm not sure I really understood why it's called a collector street in the first place. It sounds like that's what's holding everything up. Is it just a title? Is it for funding purposes? If we call it a collector street, can we get state funds to repair it? Or is it just a collector street because you kind of had to give it a classification and close enough collector it is, right? So that's kind of where I am. Just a little bit frustrated that standard is so unmovable, because nothing so far yet is actually written in law, like not the NFPA, not the design standards. So, there's definitely room for wiggle room. And in the planning department, they find variances all the time. So, I don't know, just my thoughts. So.
Well, those are your thoughts. Do you want to give just a couple of points in summary?
So for if I was to do a recommendation right now, I would say, if there is any room in the budget, I want to see a 22-foot concept, because that currently works okay. And there's no law saying we can't do it. So it seems to me it would be reasonable to try it out. But I don't know what the constraints of that are, so.
Well, I'm nursing a cold, so I'll try to keep it brief. I'm disappointed we don't have an example, or a 22-foot example to consider. I thought that's what we kind of left last meeting with, expecting. And Donna made the point that the fire code or the fire standards recommend 26 feet. I don't think we've heard any reason to go beyond 26 feet. Seems like that's reasonable. In fact, the fire recommendation is 20 feet, except in the case of a fire hydrant. So you may even look at the description of the fire code, and I think it goes into describing that you can accommodate on a 20-foot street, you can accommodate fire hydrants by building the street wider in those areas where a fire hydrant is. So it sounds as if, according to the fire professionals, a 20-foot street would be adequate for their needs with accommodation where the fire hydrants are located, which kind of begs the question about our design standards. Now, if those design standards are updated annually, I think we've identified something that might need to be reviewed. And perhaps rather than trying to defend standards that are updated every year, we should really ask staff to reconsider the standards, leading to something that maybe complies more with what the fire professionals are suggesting. Unless there's some other professional association asking for a 31-foot street. When I look at the 23rd Street design, just because it's been brought up a couple times, I just want to note that the 22-foot street was actually just two 11-foot lanes side by side, traveling in one direction. So 23rd Street was never proposed to become a 22-foot street. And thinking about that travel lane being 11 feet, if you look at the 5 concepts that were provided to us, they're really, in most cases, they aren't calling for 11-foot travel lanes. So if we think of 22 feet or 11-foot travel lane is the appropriate width for a vehicle, then we'd be looking at concept, I think, 2, which is more traditional, and it calls for, maybe it's concept, not 1, I'm sorry, bear with me here. Concept 3 has 2 11-foot lanes, there's no center lane, and then next to that are 2 5-foot bike lanes, and then there's a curb, and there's sidewalk a few feet from there. So it sounds, or to me, that seems a lot like the rest of 19th Street. It's a 36-foot wide when you include those bike lanes, but if you take the bike lanes out, it's a 22-foot street. So I then kind of wonder, like, concept 4 and 5, which are 4 is the one they're recommending, 5 is the one that I was leaning for last time. I look at both of those, and it's 31 feet of travel for cars, not 22. So I guess I kind of wonder, having those stripes on the street, does that help? I mean, should we be looking at, a design that's probably pretty consistent with the rest of 19th Street, but with actually larger bike lanes, which probably would be nice to see all along 19th Street, honestly. It just happens that it ends up becoming a wider street, but if you factor out the bike lanes, it's 22 feet of travel for cars. So I'm kind of leaning toward concept 3, because it seems to be the only one of these concepts that actually has what might appear to a person in a car to be a 11-foot lane. The others wouldn't appear that way at all. You'd appear like you have a center lane and you have a curb, and then you got about 15 and a half feet to do whatever you want. I think would lead you to drive faster, honestly. So then I have some creative ideas, like, can't we take those bike lanes and just elevate them a little bit? I'm not ready to say let's do that, but I feel like that's something we ought to think about one day, is can bike lanes be protected in some way? And if putting a vertical device in between where the cars travel and where the bikes travel, if that's not practical, then putting a little bit of a raised space for the bike seems like it should be easy enough to accommodate. I've seen that in other places, but that might be getting too far out of the box. I mean, so if we just go to these 5, I think at this point I'd lean toward concept plan 3.
Which is
Unless
31 feet with 2 5-foot bike lanes.
It's two 11-foot travel lanes for the people that drive cars, and then 2 5-foot travel lanes for people that ride bikes, and then 2 sidewalks that are each 5 feet for people that walk. So basically, it feels like you've given, 5 feet for the people that walk, 5 people that bike, 11 feet for people that drive cars. That feels pretty reasonable in terms of accommodating everybody. Now, it does, create from curb to curb, it's 36 feet, which, kind of think, well, it's because we're adding in wider bike lanes, which 19th Street honestly could really use.
Well, Charlie, I'm gonna jump in here. Personally, back to my experiential kind of approach to this, I'm gonna slow down more if I just had a 26-foot wide street, period. I believe that I would go faster on a 31-foot wide street with bike lanes. And that's my experiential kind of approach to this thing. And we'd be, trading the cycle track, which I think Lawrence needs to get cycle tracks somewhere. And I know the city commission is going to expect a cycle track, based on what I recall from that conference. So
then maybe that would be going concept 4, but asking for the street not to be 31 feet, but instead be 26 feet.
that's where I'm at,
I'd be happy with that too. I think at this point.
yeah, yeah.
It
Yeah,
seems
I think
like it
that
conforms
has
to
a
what the
better
fire
chance
professionals
of
are needing.
being accepted by more people.
I'd still go as far as saying, why is it 26 feet unless there's a fire hydrant? You have room to make a smaller, less expensive road that's safer for the neighborhood, that's going to accommodate what fire professionals need. So
Sure.
unless you're going to put a fire hydrant every foot of the way, think small and accommodate as needed. That would be another approach.
Okay.
Human scale, given what's on the street.
Well, one of the comments I've made, and I know from the public have made, is we have a really nice road just a few blocks over, and people need to use it. And if there's a need for a backup, fine, they can crawl through the 19th Street neighborhood and get where they need to go, slowly. But if they want to get somewhere fast, or they want to not have to deal with neighborhood traffic, then go to 23rd Street. And if it's so convenient to take 19th because we built it that way, then we're not prioritizing the neighborhood at all. We're literally saying that the neighborhood doesn't matter. We're trying to, achieve some other goal, which I think is not our goal, in my opinion.
Okay. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, and I brought up last time how I always feel like 19th is trying to behave. All the things that have happened on the corner of 19th and Mass in the last several years, and I really feel like that's what's trying to happen there. And what I would like to see us do is support that and encourage that, rather than, discourage it through making roads that are too wide, making roads that people want to cross, making that easy for, high school students. And
Well, some of that is starting to happen at 19th and Louisiana. And I would hope that would, having lived in University Place all those years, how that might motivate, something on 19th Street that's more walkable for kids going to Cordley and Lawrence High. I don't know what's going on at that I know that the Barker Bakery is going to open up there, and I hope that's an opportunity, to look at some of those kind of urban issues that could really help that whole neighborhood and 19th Street. So, okay, any other 19th Street comments?
I would like to see us be able to be responsive to the neighbors. I do think 31 feet is too wide, but I also feel somewhat like you that 22 may be a little narrow. I'd be leaning toward somewhere in the 26-foot area that would accommodate the fire issues, but still be able to try and listen to the needs of the neighborhood. There's no doubt in my mind, a 31-foot street, there's going to be speed issues, and we're going to be back in there doing speed bumps or speed cushions or something. I think that's just too wide for that short street.
Well, I'll try to summarize this so we can move on now. It seems like we're hearing 26 feet from a lot of people up here. I personally, like I said earlier, if you change that option 4 and change the dimension to 26 feet, I think you got it, right, Jason?
Yeah, essentially.
Pretty much. There might be grade issues or something, but That's essentially it. So if that's easy to do, without a lot of drawing and a lot of change orders and a lot of expenses, fine. I personally don't need to see that drawing myself, but if others up here think we do, then I think we ought to make that part of our recommendation. But what I'm hearing right now is a 26-foot wide. Sure.
Is that 26 feet back of curb?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Michael. That's what I'm hearing here. So if somebody'd like to put that into a motion. Well, wait, before we do that, go ahead, Dave.
One point of clarification. I believe, I mean, the fire department recommendation in regards to the 26-foot would be face of curb to face of curb. That's what they're going to tell me. So if it's back of curb to back of curb, which would probably be closer to 25 feet, fire department's they're going to tell me, no, it's not feasible where there's fire hydrants. So
Okay.
I just
Go
so
ahead,
you
Erin.
know that,
So what's the?
and that
on
would be
a-
less than our residential street width.
Okay.
So that would be my question. What's the residential street width? Is it face of curb to face of curb?
That would be closer to 26 feet. That would be a 27-foot back of curb to back of curb. The
27
curb's
foot
about
back of
6
curb to back of
inches on
curb.
either side, so.
Well, I think we better go with that then.
And just
I do.
anecdotally, I know how a fire truck can operate through there because we had a fire in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
My neighbor's house caught
Mhm.
fire and
Mhm.
there were cars parked on both sides of the street. Now, no one could get around
Mhm.
while the fire was put out, but
Sure, sure.
Sorry, just for one final clarification, Charlie, did you say that the 26 back or front to front or whatever, was that when fire hydrants were directly across the street from each other? Because if so, just don't put them right across the street from each other. I
No, I
mean,
think it's the 26 feet where there's a fire hydrant.
just in general. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So I'd say if there's no fire hydrants, then 26 feet is too much.
Okay. I have one more question, sorry. I know we're going away from number 5, the concept plan with the elevated bike lane. That was because of the concern for snow removal. Mr. Hoskinson, have you designed one of these before? One of these street profiles with the elevated bike lanes? Has any municipality ever accepted one of these?
I can't think of any recently around here
Okay.
that I'm familiar with. I mean, it's kind of sort of going towards a shared use path type of design, just on 2 sidewalks essentially instead
Okay.
of.
I guess the reason I'm asking is, if we had snow removal problems, does that mean everybody has snow removal problems, or is Lawrence kind of unique in that regard?
No,
we just don't have the
I think this
others,
would be
do
a unique installation in
Okay.
this region.
Kind of breaking new ground.
Just working in this region, I haven't seen it. so.
Okay.
so I have a question about that too, just because from the picture, it looks like it's kind of a hump. Would it look something like this? I don't know if you can see that. Road, it's like a 3 or 4 inch curve.
Yeah, it would be similar.
And it's 10 foot wide, it looks like from the
Yeah, so in that
image.
picture, it looks a lot wider. I mean, in the cycle track issue.
Well, in this picture, this might be wider.
Yeah,
It's-
yeah. The option or the consideration of, and Commissioner Bryan brought it up too, elevating that bike lane a little bit, really comes into play more with stormwater drainage issues and where's that water going? How do you collect it? How do you safely collect it? How do you avoid a bicyclist driving off the curb and falling into the motorist's lane? There's some other issues that we have to look at too, but again, down in the weeds design, if we went that way, that's things we would need to be looking at, so.
Okay? Michael, thank you for that point of order. It's helpful. Appreciate it. Someone want to put this into a motion for us? No takers? Come on.
Want me to try, Charlie?
I'm not happy with really any of the options, so I just,
I'll take a stab at it. I recommend that, or make a motion that we recommend concept 4 with a 26-foot wide front of curb to front of curb option, and leaving everything else the same with the cycle track and the sidewalks.
Do you need to make a decision about the roundabout/intersection, or has that been done already? Because that's still up in the air, right? As to which of those concepts we prefer? Sorry to keep piling on, but I'm pretty sure that's a part of the proposed designs as well.
Yeah, we're not recommending the roundabout. But if you want to weigh in on that,
Okay, in that
if you
case,
want to see something other than the four-way stop,
no.
please.
So staff has already recommended the four-way stop then?
Correct.
Cool.
So just some thoughts on that cycle track or some concerns. I don't know, because that cycle track would not be going very far. Is that, I want to be convinced that that's the best choice there.
I'll try that. The elevated bike path right adjacent to the back of the curb, personally, I would feel uncomfortable on a bike there. It's too close to traffic relative to a separated cycle track. I also like the idea of, and I don't think it's best for the discussion in this group, but from a sustainability perspective, I think you have a better chance of getting an open ditch without that solution, with a separated cycle track some distance from the back of the curb. And I would like to see the city get to the point where we're actually considering stuff like that. I think that is creative and out of the box and a sustainable solution to stormwater. So that's my,
Okay.
I personally.
I mean, I like the elevated bike lane, but I think I like the idea of it, not necessarily the location. I mean, where I've seen it happen has been in very urban areas where the speed of car traffic is low, is that picture I had. And so it makes sense maybe there, whereas in that location,
Well, you might find a location where you have site constraints.
yeah.
If you're thinking about Iowa, north of 15th Street on the east side.
Yeah,
With
but,
the retaining
yeah.
wall and, you know, when you want to put a elevated bike lane there, might make sense under those conditions. But if you had the choice, just like the comments on 19th Street, walking to Cordley, right on the back of the curb, you've got a sidewalk and traffic. So I personally wouldn't jump up and down about that solution. So I think most of us are okay with the four-way stop at Harper. Anybody want to speak up if they're not?
Probably would have a second.
Hmm?
Do we have a second?
No. But I want to make sure everybody's okay with that. Thanks for bringing that up, Nick. I guess everybody is. So we're back to Ron's motion. Do we have a second? Second by Aaron. All those in favor say aye and raise your hand. Aye. Motion passes
You
unanimously.
can ask for nays, and I'm kind of curious.
Oh, I'm sorry. Any nays?
Nay.
One nay. Okay.
Because I feel like we're compromising on something that's already a variance. So why not go for what we truly can go and is already there and what the neighborhood wants and what a fire truck can drive on? I mean,
Okay,
so that's why, kind of a protest vote, I guess.
okay. Thank you.
What about the connection to O'Connell? Are we-
Well, the motion passes 7-1, with Nick being the no vote. Okay, Carol?
Supporting the 22-foot option for the record.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah,
So option 4, it had the cycle track, so 10-foot cycle track, 2 sidewalks,
yes,
26-foot inside curb,
Mhm.
27-foot back of curb.
Right.
Okay,
that's it.
just want to make sure.
Okay. Go ahead, Carol.
So are we saying that we're okay with connecting to O'Connell Road?
Yes, we are.
I'm not.
Well,
Should I make an amendment or try?
I think that's part of our scope, is it?
the design options, well, gee, Carol, I don't know where to go with that. I think you're on the record now. I don't know that we need to do anything formally. You made the comment during the discussion, and it's part of the record. So I'm good with that.
Well, it doesn't look like there's any interest.
Well, I don't think you need to make the point more than once, and I think you made the point well, so thank you. Okay. Moving on to the next agenda item. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
No real issue.
Okay, we're to agenda item 4, the 2020 to 2024 Bike Ped Funding Plan.
Good evening, Commission. I'm Jake Baldwin, Senior Project Engineer with MSO. With this item, staff is going to ask for a recommendation on the proposed 5-year program for projects for the $3.2 million in the CIP, Project CI09, the Bike Ped funds for the years 2020 to 2024. This is something we've talked about in the past, trying to be proactive about programming these projects, so this is the first attempt to do so. Projects were programmed to be equitably split between bicycle and pedestrian projects, and were guided by the scores in our non-motorized projects prioritization policy. Consideration also had to be given to the individual project budgets so they could fit in with our yearly bike ped funds that we have allowed. City staff has also recently submitted our TA grant applications, which we brought to you last month. Should any of these be awarded, design fees for those awards would have to come out of our 2020 next year's bike ped funds, and then our 20% construction match would then have to come out of our 2021 bike ped funds. So I say that so we can keep in mind that even though we're proposing a 5-year plan of programs here, we need to be able to adapt should we receive any grant awards. And with that, I'll zoom in a little bit here. Looking at our pedestrian projects, we can see we've got projects for West 9th Street, Massachusetts, a slew of projects there on Naismith. And if I jump to our next sheet, you'll see our scoring from our prioritization policy. And the projects you saw on the previous page are the projects I've got here highlighted in yellow, showing that the projects that have been programmed on that previous sheet are our higher scoring projects from our policy. So we're trying to follow the guidance of that policy. If we jump back again and look at our bicycle projects, the first 2 years of the program there are projects from our Bicycle Boulevards projects, funding for the 13th Street project, as well as the intersection improvement projects that were pulled out of the Bicycle Boulevard projects themselves, following with 2 shared use path projects on 6th Street. Then below, we've got a breakdown of the funding that is in Project CI09 per year, showing how I'm trying to equitably split these projects, as well as balance that with our yearly funding. So in years 2020, 21, and 22, you'll see that our spending is very close to what our allocation is. And then in 2023, we kind of slowed down so that we're able to build 2 larger projects in 2024. The project maps are also included in this memo, and I think that that's all the information I kind of want to convey with you to jumpstart this conversation. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you've got on the projects we've got laid out here.
So the Bike Boulevard for 21st Street is actually part of the 2019
Yes, that's already been
funding.
approved by
So
commission.
that's a done deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the exception, of the projects that are always pulled out, the intersection
Right.
improvements at 19th and Osdale and 21st
Okay.
and Mass.
On the PED projects, 7th and Tennessee didn't make it because?
It's already in the CIP. It's a funded project.
It's already, okay,
Mhm.
okay.
Good. Well, I don't have any questions. I think generally this kind of reflects our discussion over the last several months in terms of projects that we have discussed and debated and keep coming on, into view. So from my perspective, it's pretty reflective of what we've already talked about. Anybody see anything different or any suggestions for looking at other projects? We'll get to the public here in a second, Gary.
On the bike projects, this list, can you tell us which ones are already programmed? That I'm looking at like the top 5 there that are not highlighted.
Right. So the path at Iowa Street, I think we discussed that briefly with our TA application. We don't have a good estimate for it yet, but we know it's going to be quite expensive. But that is the highest scoring project here. Lawrence Loop Bircham Park, we've currently got that under design, or pardon me, no, that is, we don't know enough about our proposed alignment really to give you a good estimate on what that project's going to take. And then we get down here, the next grouping of projects are all 16s. We don't have good estimates yet for our bike lanes there, but we've got them ready for 6th Street, and we know that they score similarly, so.
So the Naismith Drive, 18th to 23rd, the Mass Street, 14th to 21st, those are bike lanes?
Yes, they are. And I could say too that we need to go back and analyze our facility types for some of the existing projects that are out here. So those may change a bit, but I believe those are all fine, the bike lanes.
So it sounds like then the qualifier for not being on the list is not having a good estimate, or it's already programmed with other funds. So for the ones that you do not yet have an estimate, either because, say, the railroad is holding up stuff, or because it's just a big project, do you predict any of these coming into clearer focus in the time that it could take to get them on the list? Say, for example, let me just pick one out of random here. Say Massachusetts Street, 14th to 21st, bike lane, total points 16. Say that ends up, once you get around to a more solid estimate, to be exact same cost as 6th Street, Iowa to Wisconsin. It's in 2 years. Is there enough time to switch it through, or is this hard and set regardless of how the estimate comes in,
No,
even though it's scored higher?
It's not hard and set.
Okay, well, that's good news.
Ideally, I would have had all those estimates to bring back to you guys and taken recommendation into account.
Estimating is hard. I feel your pain. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we're also, we're planning on going through this process every year. So really want to nail down the 2020 project so we can start design as soon as we hit January. And then as the city looks at the citywide budget through that same process, we would, in the spring, reevaluate the projects and have a 2021 to 25 program. So it could change a little bit over time. And I would also mention on some of the projects with the bike lanes, those two could be projects that are more economical when we do a maintenance project. So if we're doing a mill and overlay on Mass Street in a few years, the cost would be significantly lower than having a standalone project. So there's probably some opportunity costs too that aren't factored into the point system on some of the bike lane projects.
It sounds like it may be potentially a good suggestion for incorporating into the prioritization program in the future. How likely is this project to be much cheaper if you do it while you do something else that's already kind of scheduled? I mean, because that would probably move it lower in the prioritization program if it was probably going to come about anyway, right? Just a thought, but that's not the conversation that we're having, so.
Just to
Go ahead.
clarify some fuzzy areas. So Naismith Drive, we're talking about Naismith Drive adding sidewalks? Yeah?
On the PED projects? Yes, on the east side of the road.
Is that in conjunction with redoing that road?
If, on here, it's not in conjunction with redoing it.
It's not.
I mean, right now, it's in the 2024 CIP, but it's unfunded, I
Okay,
believe.
so the redoing that road is in the 2024 CIP?
And it's
unfunded?
not a funded project. It was identified as a
Okay.
need, but not funded.
Okay.
So we have a list of unfunded projects that we feel we need to do. Naismith needs some work, needs to be rebuilt, and so we that we requested that to be in there for 2024 and was unfunded, which would theoretically push it out to a year beyond 2024 as we go through that process again this spring, unless it becomes more of a need than other projects in the CIP.
So with doing Naismith Drive, the sidewalks there impact that at all? I mean, I guess I'm asking if when they redo Naismith, if it's going to rip up those sidewalks, if it's gonna, you know, if that's,
It's a good question. We would need to look at it a little further, but I think we could, I don't see the need to make Naismith any larger, wider.
right,
and
more
so-
of construction issues.
Yeah,
My original reason for asking this is because I was thinking, well, I was on Naismith and it's kind of a mess, which is okay. People are driving pretty slow, so it's traffic calming, I guess. But just because making sure that those are standalone projects rather than using funding to help pay for projects that are already being done that might have in the past. I mean, this has come up before in the past. They might add sidewalks when we redid a street, and just making sure that that funding is being used the way it was intended.
yeah, if I understand your concern or question, if we were rebuilding the street, we would put in the sidewalks with funds for the street project,
Yes,
would be that's the way we've done it in the past.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure that wasn't what was happening there, just because looking at Naismith, knowing the future
But
for
that,
it.
yeah, that's a future decision, but that's
Yeah.
the way we've tackled it in the past.
All right.
Why don't we do public comment and then come back up here and wrap this up? Gary?
Gary Weber, 907 Murrow Court. I agree with you, Steve. This is what you've been working toward. It seems consistent with everything you've talked about all along. I really appreciate the work on 9th Street. 9th Street's an excellent east-west corridor. It's one of our few, you know, the university blocks most east-west access unless you go south, and 6th is extremely busy, not good pedestrian. But 9th is an excellent pedestrian pathway, and there's some missing chunks. And I wanted to ask David, what do you plan to do, David, on the first 200 feet of 9th Street, just west of Iowa? Both sides of the street, we've got parking lots to go right to the curb. How are you going to put a sidewalk over a parking lot?
I know on the north side there, part of that parking lot is within the right-of-way, so I know there's room in there to get the sidewalk in.
Would you tear the parking lot out and then put in a sidewalk? Is that what the plan would be?
Well, I think the intent would be to utilize the right-of-way for the sidewalk,
Okay.
right?
And the same way with the Merck on the south side?
I'm not familiar with the situation on the
Well,
south
their
side.
parking lot basically goes to the curb, so, okay, I'm sure you'll figure out a good way of doing it. I wonder about the section from Holiday to Avalon. It's $500,000 in extremely challenging topography, and there's a very good sidewalk. I know we try to get sidewalks on both sides of Collectors and Arterials, and I think that's commendable, but this may be one we want to look closely at that and see if it's really worth $500,000 to put 300 foot of sidewalk along a very, very challenging retaining wall, extreme topography, slope. David is, well, so I think you might want to look at that as time approaches. Is that something you really want to do? And finally, the Naismith thing, I think you need a lot more thought on this, because in rebuilding the street, there's a couple of concepts that are kind of fighting each other right now. One is a complete street, maybe 3 lanes with protected bike lanes. That's one concept. Another concept is 5 lanes with a shared youth path on one side. Because I know that a lot of the Brook Creek folks and the people in East Lawrence would like to get traffic off of 19th Street, especially traffic coming from the university. They don't want to restrict flow of traffic from 19th to 23rd. They want to open it up so cars coming from the parking garages and the university come right down Naismith out to 23rd and go east and west. So if you restrict Naismith too much there, you kind of mitigate going on 19th Street. And I know the neighborhoods don't want that. So if you put sidewalks on the east side of Naismith, then you've kind of negated the possibility for a shared use path option there. And so I think the discussion needs to take place so that you're talking about what kind of street we're going to put in there, because that affects what kind of sidewalk you're going to put in there. So I think you better have that conversation earlier rather than later, so that you know what kind of a street Naismith is going to be, so that you can plan for the proper sidewalk for pedestrians and/or bicyclists. So Aaron's question was good. I didn't hear an answer. When is Naismith scheduled for reconstruction?
It is not scheduled for reconstruction.
Okay.
It shows up in the CIP as an unfunded project in 2024.
Okay.
Which, unless things change and priorities change and we get more funds, it would get pushed to an out year beyond that.
Okay, well, I really think you ought to talk about that street before you put in a sidewalk, before you really seriously get to 24 and you're putting in a 5-foot sidewalk. I think you ought to have a plan for Naismith before you go ahead and do that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary. I'm certain that we had that discussion a couple years
yes,
ago.
we did.
Same thing, going to put in a sidewalk. Michael jumped up and made the point
Yes,
that you just
Yes.
made.
yes.
And I would expect
Well-
that we would have that same conversation a year from now.
Yeah, I mean, the point I made is if we're redoing that road and it can be
Yeah,
redone, that can all be redone with the funding when that road is redone, then I don't think we should use standalone pedestrian funding. But also, it just seems like that's, I mean, clearly it's not imminent. But it's been talked about a lot, it needing to be rebuilt, so I don't know. I do have a concern about that being a 2021 project. I mean, I guess it's the plan, but, yeah, so I just have concerns about that. But the other thing I wanted to ask about was 2023. I just want to clarify. So that's 15th Street, where that sort of rocky, small bluff there on 15th Street?
Yes, that's correct. The east side of Iowa Street from 15th Street north to University Drive on the east side.
So I remember this coming up only because when I entered into bicycle and pedestrian advocacy stuff in Lawrence, that's what was happening. Schweb was leaving, Dave was coming, and I asked Schweb, what are you gonna do about the sidewalk here, or how are you gonna? And it was determined it was too geographically challenging or expensive. So I was just wondering what was gonna happen there, because you've got that sort of bridge over the gully. So I didn't know,
A new engineer.
a better engineer.
I know there's some funding for retaining walls in that project.
Okay,
yeah.
so now we can do it. So I was just curious if that was the
I
same thing
appreciate
we were
seeing that
trying
one
to.
on there.
Yeah, yeah, I
That's
think
just-
it's good. I wanted to
it's a
see
huge
it happen
barrier.
at the time. I actually backed my house at that time back to that intersection and was kind of disappointed not to see it connect all corners. But
We're free-forming here a little bit. Chris, do you want to add something here? Go ahead.
I'm Chris Tilden. I live at 1121 Williamsburg Court. First, I'd like to note that several years ago, we weren't having this discussion, so it's exciting that we're to the point where we get to talk about allocation of bike ped funding. And I don't have comments for or against the plan. As Steve mentioned, I think this in total kind of reflects where we as a community and where you all have been talking about, the direction that we need to head in the last couple of years. The 6th Street Shared Use Path is also one of the projects I know that was included in the Transportation Alternatives grant process. So, and I know you're aware of that. I was kind of curious as to how the perceived timing of that, i.e. if this is funded through TA, is there then a process to reconfigure what city spending would look like?
Yes, that's the intent, that should the TA grants be awarded, all of them, any number of them, that this would have to be altered.
And I believe the TA would be a 21 funding to
Construction, yes.
construction, so, yeah, we would certainly have to do that. And we should know by the spring, at about the same time we're getting ready to go through this process again. So, but yeah, definitely we'll need some flexibility as we apply for grants, if we get them.
Go ahead.
Back to Naismith. It desperately needs to be done, but I do remember that and the discussion on the multi-use path, and that would make a lot of sense, and I think it would.
I totally agree.
I just think it'd make more sense when the road is redone, as much as I don't want to see
Well, I think the
another
point that
10
was
years with
made-
nothing there.
I think the point that someone made a couple of years ago was, if you're going to put a sidewalk there, put a shared use path there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that way you've got that, and then
And-
you can decide when you get around to Naismith, how to deal with it. But
Well, yeah,
at least you've got a bike facility.
And the concern that came up at that time was that some of that is pretty close to, there are about 2 or 3 houses, I think, that are very
There's some
tight.
constraints.
Yeah.
Yeah. But connecting the university through the Naismith Trail, clear to the Burroughs Trail, is a big deal. So that whole,
Mm-hmm. Yep,
area.
it is. That's a
needs
big
considerable
connection.
thought.
Yeah, and we're trying with our bike plan to not specify now what the bike facility would be later, and instead wait until we have more data on the speed and volume, because that can change over time, and use the guide at that time to determine what the bike facility should be, or what the level of comfort would be for the different types of facilities. So, I remember we've talked about it before,
Mhm.
and not knowing when it could be funded. I felt for a long time we needed a sidewalk along there because you can see the path that people walk in, so it's,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's
just-
not a good walk
No.
from 19th to 23rd on Naismith, any way you look at it. It's a bad deal.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem really important. It just seems like it makes more sense to do with the road, but just thoughts.
Is the Massachusetts Street 14th to 21st bike lane, is that, you mentioned, I know in the past you've mentioned Massachusetts Street might be resurfaced at some point. Is that one scheduled at all?
It's not. We're actually revamping our street maintenance program here, going into next year, and we're going to do a different assessment process and do them all here pretty soon, assess all the streets in Lawrence and come up with different types of funding options to hopefully getting some additional funds to do more streets, and then looking at some more data to prioritize the streets. And so, well, that's a long answer, but we're trying to work towards a new process, and don't know at this point when that could come up. So it'll be just, we have a long list of needs, and don't know where that would fit in at this point, but.
All righty. Unless somebody wants to modify something on here, I'd suggest we go ahead and make a motion.
That we stick with the recommendation of the programming projects for the sidewalk bike ped improvements project for 2020 to 2024.
Second.
Motion by Nick, second by Carol. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. I'm way away from my agenda, sorry.
Can we do a quick break? It's been 2 hours.
Can we take a break?
Yeah,
You want to take a break?
Yeah.
because the next one might be long, so.
Okay. 5-minute break.
this is right east of the. That's a big detention basin. The one in North Topeka is like just this size.
And let's move on to item number 5, the shared scooter pilot program.
All right. Good evening again. So we've got about a 5 or 6 page draft RFQ. This has been developed based off some of our conversations that we had with our micromobility subcommittee on some of the key things that we looked at, and we tried to insert that into an RFQ to start a pilot program, which was the consensus of the committee. I guess a brief history of the process so far. Earlier this year, had some requests for some vendors to operate a shared scooter program in Lawrence, like electronic scooters that you've seen in other communities. We've, the Transportation Commission formed a subcommittee, micromobility subcommittee, and the first thing that we've looked at with that subcommittee was a shared scooter pilot program. Based off of those meetings, and then looking at best practices from other communities, NACTO actually recently came out with a guidelines for developing policies and programs for shared scooters that staff reviewed in putting this together. We looked at other communities, and our subcommittee specifically had a conversation with the city of Omaha that instituted a pilot program, and I used their template for RFQ as a template for the city of Lawrence, and we've inserted some things into here as well to tailor to Lawrence. I would also say that originally we discussed involvement with the University of Kansas and discussed Donna's involvement with being on the Transportation Commission on that micromobility subcommittee, and didn't think that with their existing partnership with VORI, I didn't think it would be a good idea, or there could be a conflict of interest with her being on that subcommittee. But we did have had some conversations with her and sent a draft of this over to KU and incorporated some of the things that I think they want to see or want to be open to as we get proposals from vendors. So I think that I'll walk through this, and I'm not going to read verbatim, but probably highlight a few things that that are in here. The first down here is that we were looking at doing a 6-month pilot program. Staff thought that having agreements with up to 2 companies would be something that we could manage, and that given where we're at today and the process we need to go to, it would be maybe feasible to start in the spring, April 1st, and go the beginning of October. I would say that all of the dates and language in here is still in draft form, and we want to get comments from stakeholders and potential vendors and you and the public to before we send a recommendation to the City Commission. But looking at starting in the spring, some of the requirements are pretty similar to requirements of other communities and the requirements that the Transportation Commission Subcommittee has talked about. We've asked the companies to provide an overview of the company and along with any cities that are similar in size to Lawrence where they operate, so that we could review and compare the way they operate in those cities. We also asked down here in the description about the technology that they would provide, if they were going to provide the most up-to-date generation of scooters. One of the points that we talked about with the subcommittee and that other communities have used as a threshold for max speed is 15 miles an hour, so we have inserted that into the RFQ. The visibility of the lights is consistent with that by state law of the bicycles in Kansas, so that 500-foot note is in there. We've had a lot of conversations about during the pilot program what time to operate. I think we generally feel comfortable allowing them to operate during daylight hours. We've put in here 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Do know that from talking to other communities, most trips are taken later in the afternoon or evening, and so that may be more desirable, or you may see more trips taken, but I think for a pilot type program to see how it works here in Lawrence, I think it's going to be important to see how they work during the daytime when I think it's a little safer or perceived to be safer. Also, another thing that as technology has evolved with these e-scooters, the geofencing and the ability to have designated zones, including downtown and KU, to restrict speeds and operations, and if the university wants to have a different top speed than we have on city streets, that is a possibility, and or if we need to look at keeping the scooters off of specific streets or areas in and around downtown, if that becomes an issue or is a concern, that there's some ability to restrict the use in areas. So I think that's an important factor. Under maintenance and operations, we've talked about looking at a total fleet size to no more than 500. If we went with 1 or 250 each, if we went with 2, and that may need to be reworded a little bit, but I think our intent was to have some limitation on the number, but still have a high enough number that we were able to get some data and see how they're used. Another concern that we've talked about is how they're charged and distributed, and we've, I think, feel pretty strongly in having the type of scooters that folks aren't picking up off the street and carrying them into their homes to charge them themselves, and that the companies would be responsible for swapping out the batteries or charging the scooters, which also helps them provide more point of contact with the scooters on a recent basis versus going a long time without making contact with them. So I feel like that's kind of a best practice as well. We've got some information in here about them providing contact information about their company and 24/7 operations, so that the expectation is that the company with an agreement with the city would be responsible for maintaining their scooters and operating in a manner that they are handling complaints and questions from users. We've also asked for companies to provide a history of their safety history, a summary regarding collisions that have been reported in other markets that they operate and the rate of collisions. Complaint history report as well as another thing that we've asked for. A community engagement plan. I think this is going to be a key for implementing scooters in the community is the education portion on where they can be operated. We've had we have had some discussions with the subcommittee on not allowing them on streets that are in excess of 35 miles per hour. So that's been noted in here. Some language on a user equity plan that folks that may not have access to the app feature may be able to have another way to pay. We have some information on privacy policy and data breach history. I won't go through that in details, but if there's any questions on that, please let me know. Data sharing as well is a key thing that if we're going to evaluate this program at the end of the 6 months, being able to have data is going to be important. And so we haven't specified any forms of data, but we would like the companies to provide us, what can they provide us to evaluate this program, or what options are there for us to receive data that we can evaluate the pilot program. Under infrastructure, investment and management, we talked about having the companies provide a plan to operate in downtown Lawrence and the University of Kansas campus specifically, because we know those are going to be key areas. Under fees, we talked about this a little more at a staff level and landed on having the companies deposit a cash escrow to the city that the city could use to reimburse themselves for any expenses that were incurred for staff time that needed to go out and remove a scooter or handle an issue. And I guess I would note that some of these points would need to be probably more formally laid out in the agreement, the legal agreement on how that all works, but that would be the intention. And I guess I would go on by saying that we would expect a minimum balance of $5,000 of that original $10,000. So once it hit that level, that they would need to recharge back to $10,000. The insurance requirements, these are pretty standard with our other city requirements for vendors. We did have a note there on cyber liability insurance, which our risk management person thought was appropriate. I got that off of the Omaha RFQ. And that is it for some of the bullet points. We did, on the last page on the selection process, kind of outlay how the evaluation team would review and evaluate the proposals. We haven't made any decisions on how many people would be on the evaluation team or who would be, but I think it would be, we've discussed the appropriateness of KU having some members on the team, as they would likely be a partner in this project through an MOU. It would be a little bit in reverse of the way the bike share is. The KU selected the vendor and entered into an agreement with VO Ride for the bike share, and KU and the city operates on an MOU underneath their program. So that's kind of an overview of the things we have put in the report. I would say that there's we still need to have a little more, some more discussions. Specifically met with Sally at DLI here today, and we're going to talk a little more about getting a meeting set up with downtown businesses to get their input on ways that we can look at parking and enforcement and education, specifically in and around Mass Street, and we don't have any intentions on allowing the scooters on the sidewalks downtown, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And enforcement and education is going to be key to this pilot program. So I would say that we've outlined some of the things we're looking with in this RFQ, but certainly we're going to leave it up to the different vendors to provide us with their best program, and there may be things in here that we don't even know about that are best practices, and that we would evaluate all of those as we receive submittals. And so I guess that's kind of an overview of how we got here with this, and looking for a recommendation to proceed. And if there's any other notes or feedback, we're willing to get those as well. And I think next steps would be finalize with getting any comments and finalizing this. We'll go to the city commission, but I think we want to meet with downtown before we do that. And if there's any other things that we need to look at, we could do that as well before we make a recommendation to the city commission. But with that, I'll stand for any questions and then public comment.
Okay. Regarding parking, Dave, particularly downtown, are the proposers going to propose geofenced areas as part of what they're going to bring to the table? Or is the city going to say Vermont Street, 8th Street? Are you going to designate those parking areas?
Yeah, we haven't determined yet if we're going to make specific areas or how that's going to work. I think downtown is going to be the most sensitive issue by far. And having 500 scooters, there's not enough bike rack parking to realistically think that they can
So
all
how's
be in a
that going to
bike
be
path.
determined as to be utilized during the pilot program?
Well, I think, you know, we're going to need to look for areas where they could park, if that's possible. If there's just absolute opposition to having them downtown at all, we need to have that discussion and see if there's areas around downtown where they could be parked. So I don't have all those answers.
Right.
I know that's a huge sticking point with this.
I'm asking more of a process question as opposed to where. By the time the pilot program starts, that will have been determined.
Yeah.
I assume.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with the program, I think we would need to have the flexibility to modify the locations and the restrictions as we go. So I think the flexibility in if it's just not working downtown, we cannot allow them downtown.
Yeah.
And that's yeah. I don't have all the answers. Sally's had a lot of questions for me today too, and I know we talked with Omaha and looked at other cities, and some had looked at prohibiting them in areas, and others hadn't, and then they end up down there anyway. And so it's more of creating a plan. If we think it's a good thing for the city, creating a plan so it's managed. And enforcement and education, we talked about with traffic calming, it's going to be the same things here. How do we educate users and enforce the users or the company that's allowing the users to use their product to meet our regulations? So.
Okay. Did we talk to law enforcement folks yet about this and get their feedback?
They're concerned about the safety. So we, in our multimodal staff team meetings, they've just voiced their concern about safety because it's something new, and they're the ones that would be enforcing any issues. And I think that's something that other communities have had the same concerns, and our police department's the same way. So,
okay.
But we've kind of asked them to asked everyone to be open to change, open to something new. Transportation's evolving. There's more than just these shared scooters. We've talked about motorized skateboards, and people are using other devices, and how are we going to adapt as a community to a changing environment? And so hopefully this pilot program gives us the ability to analyze the utilization of the scooters, see if they're effective or see if they're not, and allow us to make a decision going forward. So we didn't have anything in here what we're going to do after October 1st, if that is the end of the 6 months. Some communities have had language in there that said there's an option to renew. I haven't included anything in there. My assumption at this point would be that after that 6 months, we take some time to evaluate the program. And I think some of that's going to be, whether it's citizen survey or, of course, safety issues if we've had documented, if we've been documenting crashes and versus the miles that have been traveled with them. So I think overall, there's been some data that's shown that per mile traveled, the crash history is relatively low, but it's the ones that happen that are severe that have caused a lot of public concern in other communities and have been the deciding factor on whether or not they're allowed. So by and large, I think we're open to this, and that's why we've kind of looked at the daylight hours to start and the number as well, capping at 500. But
I have a couple questions.
Go ahead, Nick.
All right, so the most, I guess, technical and probably cut and dry one. In our discussions back in the subcommittee meetings, we originally talked about having lights visible from 300 feet because I'd seen that elsewhere. They now are visible from 500 feet. Any reason for upping that? Is that from the NACTO guide or other information that you've gotten in the meantime?
The 500 foot is the statute on bicycles.
Oh, okay, cool.
So if that's not achievable, if a vendor says, hey, we can't do that, or all the vendors can't do that, then we would need to look at changing that. But that's the...
Like state statute or city ordinance or what? For 500 feet visibility on bicycles?
That's state statute.
Okay. Okay. So in that case, I think you were saying that the idea with the, I guess, time window was kind of done to limit the concerns over nighttime riding of scooters. But if we're rolling this out in spring, I mean, 8 p.m. it's dark. So that means we're gonna run into lighting concerns almost immediately, simply due to the rollout time. So in that case, is the concern about the lighting, or is it more just we needed some numbers to go with? Because I think in my notes I actually have 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. as an example. So was that exact window informed by other RFPs that you've seen, or did staff decide that that was the ideal time?
I don't think I got that from another RFP. I think we just decided that would be the time.
Okay.
Depending on when they roll out, if it is April 1st, I don't know.
So it sounds like then, if they're going to be operating during dark hours anyway, why end at 8? Why not at 10, for example? I mean, just throwing it out there. If anybody wants to go out to the bars, then by 10 they're in the bars and have to figure out a way home, right? But at least they can get to the bars. I'm just saying.
I think that
It's a personal
the guy
problem.
from Omaha said the majority of the use is between 7 and 9 p.m.
Yeah.
Which
means
was
that we're-
really surprising to me. But,
Yeah. Probably because at that point you don't need a suitcase to go to work, or briefcase, or giant purse, or whatever your preferred mode of toting things is. At that point, just free, you know? So, and these aren't particularly great at carrying cargo, so
Right.
that might go into it. So, anyway, that was one of the potential recommendations I would have, is to extend that just a little bit, because we're going to be dealing with dark anyway, and there are concerns for lights in there, so it's like, it's halfway there. What else? That's it for actual questions at this point, but, oh, actually, I did have another question. How did the conversation with Downtown Lawrence go? Any concerns raised so far?
I'll let Sally speak during public comment.
Sure.
I think there's the same concerns that we've all talked about with the
Okay.
subcommittee. Pretty much the same.
Nothing new?
Same concerns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yep.
That's good that we
But
didn't totally
There's
miss
a lot of
something.
different things going on downstairs, downtown, pedestrians and
Yeah.
parking and, yeah, backing out of parking spaces. So yeah, that's,
Yeah.
not surprising.
Okay.
Okay, Carol?
You definitely need to work on the wording on the fleet size, because when I started reading it, it says restrict each company's fleet size to 500, and I'm thinking 1,000
Yep.
scooters? So that definitely needs
I
to change.
noticed that.
The liability, the insurance coverage, does that include people who are not riding the scooters? Like a pedestrian or car damage or?
I'm assuming it would be for the incident itself. I had our risk manager review it, and I didn't get any other details other than that, but it would be for the company that's operating to carry that amount of insurance.
Okay. And one last question on the selection process. Now, I'm guessing this is pretty standard that the city uses, but I'm looking at that and it says 30 points for experience. What if you have a startup business? Where are they going to get 30 points?
Yeah, the outline is kind of a general outline. Generally, if more experienced firms have more knowledge, and so you would get a few more points if you had more experience than others, but you could be a startup firm and have a better approach to implementation or quality of the program and score higher in other areas. So it's just one of several factors. It's similar to the way we evaluate consultants with RFQ process. We will not eliminate folks that have no experience, but we would certainly like to have some.
Carol,
I'm done.
you done? John?
A couple things. David, you might talk to your risk management person and consider increasing the vehicle liability insurance limits to match the general liability limits. You've got a bit of an unusual situation with motorized vehicles. And then the other thing is that the 8 o'clock might be okay, given that by the time the project starts, we'll be back on daylight savings time. So that might work.
Yeah, I thought so.
Aaron? Nope. Well, okay, we can move on to public comment. Thanks, Dave.
Good evening. My name is Kelly Fox. I'm with Byrd. Commissioners, thank you for having me, sparing some time for me. So I'll just be really quick. Byrd's super happy to jump on a call or whatever mechanism you want to use to share information as needed, whether it's data or what we've done in other cities, things like that. So we're super happy to help. And I'm also happy to field any questions. I mean, I know that's kind of not in the agenda, but a lot of the things, it's been a super interesting meeting. So all the things that you've been talking about all night are things that I talk about in other cities, about infrastructure and bike lanes and greenways and things like that. So all these things are literally in our mission, so I'm dealing with those things all the time. And as scooters come into play, there'll be other form factors, and I'll just add that we're the oldest player in the space. We kind of started the space, and we're 2 years old. So that tells you how fast the space is moving. So you're not going to be able to get your arms around it. Nobody has. I work in Chicago. Chicago's still wrestling with this thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Hello. I'm Sally Zagrai. I'm the Executive Director of Downtown Lawrence, Inc. Thank you for the work that you do. Just in general, every time I come to a city commission or any advisory board, I mean, I'm on the Explore Lawrence board, but wow, it's a lot of issues that you all are dealing with, so I thank you for your time serving the community. Jessica had very kindly reached out to me. Initially, when this issue was brought up, I want to say a month or two ago, I did write a letter of concern, wanting to be involved before the pilot program was implemented, basically, that we would be consulted, because there are so many challenges downtown. So the challenge, the concerns that we have are, as you can imagine, we don't want scooters on the sidewalks because we already have lots of people riding bicycles and skateboards on the sidewalks, which can be quite dangerous. The concern about where they're parked, are they going to be tossed down? I mean, they're easy to kind of just pick up and lay down. We already do have some issues with the Via Ride cycles and how long that they would stay there, and the having to call the director of Parks and Rec if the scooter doesn't get picked up. There was one in front of my office for a week in the 800 block of Mass. I think it's kind of crazy that I have to call Derek. I mean, he's got other things to do. So making sure that there's going to be that really timely reaction if there are issues. And then where are we going to park them? We have bike corrals, which are used, but we still have a lot of bikes that are chained up in the middle of every block to trees and to meter posts, lamp posts, where they're not supposed to be. So those are kind of the general concerns. With the time frame, I will say, quite frankly, I do worry about people getting drunk and using them, because we already have we have the police downtown enough as it is, and we have enough fender benders, et cetera, and activity late at night. So I worry about that, and just generally the scooters. Of course, my daughter, who's 14, couldn't wait to try them out in Kansas City last winter, and she had a blast at the River Market. And I've seen them when I've been in Kansas City. I am a mother of a teen and a tween, and so immediately I think they don't have a helmet on. They're racing down the sidewalk. They're not watching, for old people like me who can't get out of their way, but they're fun. And so when I met with Dave today, I said, I could see being out on the loop, and just going for it, like on a Segway kind of thing. I think it'd be great. So we don't want to necessarily shut it down, but what we will do is, I actually have my board meeting this week. I'll talk to my board. We'll just figure out a time in the next probably 3 weeks. We just have a lot going on with our members, and it's I can't have too many meetings because they get overloaded very quickly and they won't come. But we do want to have some conversation and just allow that forum for the individual business owners to express their concerns and ask any questions. Enforcement will be the key, whether it's like that for skateboards, it's like that for bicycles too. And I will say the angled parking on Mass Street is that's very concerning, because even when we just had the Parking Day, Final Friday event, if any of you are familiar with the Parking Day, we had to be sure that we were not having parking spaces on Mass Street, because anybody can turn, it's just very hard to see, and it's hard to back out, and we just want people to have a good time with them and allow them to get from point A to point B safely, which is what they're supposed to provide for us. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any for me, but we're looking forward to talking further about it.
Thank you. You're going to pass, Gary? Okay. All right. I think a brief 2 cents from my perspective is the pilot program is kind of a laboratory for us in a way, but we can't quite just put 500 scooters out there and see what happens. So I'd be real interested when we do get to rolling it out, how we conceptually, I guess you could call it conceptually since it is a pilot program, how we deal with downtown and probably KU. Those two components are a big deal. And I think we have to make some really good educated starting points in that pilot program for both of those entities, and certainly keep our eye on it as it rolls out over the 6-month period. But I do think we need to be open-minded, and I think Dave made that pretty clear about how this is a learning process for us. So I'll just make those general comments from my perspective.
What's our action on this item?
Recommend, I think we're recommending approval of the RFQ to the city commission.
If there's any feedback you have on the language, that would be appropriate, and then to recommend going forward with a pilot program.
My, been interesting discussion on the subcommittee, and then I'm glad we're here today to do this part. I think we definitely need to move forward on this. The issue came up about the time, like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. My concern there is just, are people gonna go to get on one, or they're gonna think they can take it back somewhere, and then it doesn't operate, so they just abandon it where they last were? And does that create a bigger problem because they're not, you know, where they're not being returned to some place where they might be used again, so they just all end up in downtown because that's where people go by 8 o'clock, and then they cease to function, so they're kind of having to get a ride home or something. So I don't know exactly what the right time is, but it does seem like it might lead to other unintended consequences if we are arbitrary about that decision. So I'd be open to, like, how do we move forward with this, but keep in mind that maybe maybe we listen to their proposals and have some flexibility about that particular part of the pilot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with that for the pilot, but it does seem like if you're thinking about transportation, I used to use the bus a fair amount, and that was always my issue, is I could get downtown, I could never get home. And recently, the number 11 started running till 10:30, and now my son comes to ballet and he takes the bike home, or takes the bus home. He can get there, but before he couldn't. So I just feel like if we're thinking people are going to be using this for transportation, and I think that's what they're doing, that they're going to expect to be able to, you know, get to where they're going and get home. I mean, I don't think too, when the bars close, and it sounds like that's not the way they're being used particularly in other towns. So I do feel like 8, the same time the bus is stopped, is a little early for those purposes, so.
We heard mostly 9 and 10 o'clock.
Yep, I think that would do it.
And I'm sure we're going to get feedback from the users and data in terms of who's using them and where they're going and what they're doing. And we'll learn from that. But 8 does seem a little early to me.
Mm-hmm.
Donna?
Can we recommend a different time?
Yeah, sure.
Can we ask proposers to give a time proposal of what they think
I like that idea.
would work?
They probably know it better than anybody.
Yeah.
I'd go along with that. That would work.
So just kind of a general process question. We are ideally recommending that we take this forward to city commission, right? But it sounds like Carol, that one clarification that you brought up about fleet size, that was slightly unclear. It sounds like there's a couple things that could be revised. I expect there will be more things that might be revised as you talk to more stakeholder groups. I'm just kind of off the top of my head, you got USD 497, KU, Haskell, LAN, Live Well Lawrence Bike Advocacy Network, all groups that might have some interest in this as well, whether they're really into alternative transportation, or they have a lot of people who will use it, or they might be in their neighborhoods. So obviously starting with downtown was probably the best idea because they will be affected the most for sure, but it might not be a bad idea if there is bandwidth, of course, to at least solicit feedback in a timely fashion from other groups before it heads to city commission, and then give it to city commission and say, largely this is what we want, but we've gotten some feedback from some other people so far, almost like how it goes to the city commission with public comment in writing, you know? Like, here's what the agenda item is, but here's what other people have said about it. If we could structure it like that, would that be a reasonable way to keep things moving? while also incorporating feedback and giving the city commission ultimate authority whether to take it as is, or, send it back to staff for one final draft to incorporate all those things.
Boy, there's a lot to do. You
I mean,
you just
I
reeled
kinda-
off a whole lot of stuff there.
In terms of the process I'm imagining, this is what gets us to the point where we have some proposals to review, and then there's some
Right.
process that staff will use to clarify what the agreement is between the companies that are selected. That agreement will probably be then presented to the city commission.
So we could do it on the back
Sure.
end, basically, right? Okay, that sounds reasonable. It sounds like
Probably
there's
a
enough
couple
leeway we
times,
could.
'cause the first is the agreement just to do the pilot, and then if we decide, you know what, this is not working,
Right.
you gotta change it. So that's what a pilot, I think, is about. Getting us moving forward so we can start to get some reaction. The public may not really pay attention until there are suddenly 500 scooters.
Yeah, that's true.
And then they're like, what's going
Right.
on? So it might just be easier to get it going.
Could we at least then just encourage these stakeholder groups to just submit public comment before it goes and
Yeah, that'd be great, I
check
think.
that box? Yeah.
It's always good.
When do you all want to take this to the commission?
As soon as possible.
December 20th.
As soon as we can.
Well, we
Well, things
talked
take-
about,
Things take time, and setting up meetings take time, and making changes take time. But we need to keep moving forward if we're going to do something in the spring. And, I mean, there's nothing on the books now that they can't start.
well,
people
I
can't
think we
start
talked
using them,
about
so.
issuing the RFQ no later than the end of the year. And that would give us until 2 or 3 months to get the proposals, have the interviews.
Yeah, that's
and
our
all that
intention
stuff.
with the schedule, but I don't know if we need direction on that, because it depends on when staff can get it on a city commission agenda. So we'd like to do it as soon as we feel that we have enough input and information in here, which will not be enough to everybody, I'm sure. And then I think at the agreement stage, once we get the proposals back, we can maybe tailor the agreement to some of these specific needs with the time. I think the time thing is appropriate thing to put in there for them to give us a proposal on how they would, what times they would operate, and what's the safest for them as well as a company to allow them on the street, so.
Nick,
Well-
I'd also say the input we get during the pilot program from the user groups may be more valuable than a what if,
Okay.
personally.
Yeah, and I mean, I got to say, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anything in the document. I think it's actually quite good.
Yeah.
I'm impressed that they were able to flesh out an outline table so well and add important stuff to make a really good comprehensive document. But to that effect, I feel like there's nothing more embarrassing than writing an RFP and getting no proposals. That's not fun. So my question is, Mr. Fox, is there anything that you've seen in this particular RFP that is a deal breaker that would cause somebody to just not apply?
Yes.
Okay.
The $10,000 bond.
Okay.
I think that would be a non-starter. And the reason why I say that is because the ownership should be on the companies themselves to police these sorts of things. And to some of your earlier questions, it's more education, it's more community awareness than it is enforcement. Because, like, for instance, in most of my other markets, police don't want to spend their time writing tickets for scooter, violations. And so in Chicago, what happens is they have field inspectors, and I'm not sure if you guys have those folks here, and they go out and they assess violations, and it's on a strict liability basis. So if we catch your scooter in a place where it shouldn't be, that's a violation, right? And then you go through Business Affairs, Consumer Protection, you go to their hearing, and there's an administrative fine, which is more revenue for the city. That's how that's handled.
Okay, so it sounds like then, for a large city with a lot of departments and presumably the resources to pull it off, it sounds like they can have these inspectors make it happen. In a city that's significantly smaller, it might need to maybe almost be shifted, I dare I say it, onto the citizens themselves to kind of report scooters out in the wrong place. Could it be more of a direct line from just people who see the hotline on whoever scooter it is, call the company and say, all right, I'll be on it? Would that be a way to shorten the process and still make it possible to shift that bond back to you guys? So it's like, the the onus of handling issues is on you then?
Yes, and
Okay.
so it really comes down to operations. So there are companies who, have really, really good operations and are able to respond to problems really quickly. So in most RFPs that I see, there's a requirement within 2 hours you have to have this remedied. So, and again, that results in penalties if you don't do that kind of thing. And there are companies that aren't able to do that, right? So operations is really key. So the better operators will be on it because, again, it's our reputation. So we have a built-in incentive to sort of do that.
Okay, so in that case, I guess back to the original point you raised, is the $10,000 bond escrow, whatever it's being called itself, is it the dollar amount that's a deal breaker, or just the fact that any money up front has to be paid for almost like a apartment security deposit?
Yeah, I think it's the dollar amount, because
Okay.
if we're only operating 500 scooters in the aggregate, we're not making enough money to be able to substantiate a $10,000, bond.
So are we talking 5,000 is more reasonable, or 2,500? I'm not sure how the business model works.
I mean, I guess if I had to peg it, I'd say 1,000 or 1,500, because, again, speaking for myself, I would anticipate that we would not run up $1,500 in cost to the city in terms of violations and poor operations. We would rather have that money, the remaining money tied into our operations, paying people to make sure that they go out and remedy these problems before they arise or shortly thereafter.
So what then would be your recommendation for companies that aren't as on top of it as Bird, for example, some startup that's just kind of getting their operational style all together? If they can't get on issues as quickly as you guys can, would it be appropriate to have some kind of escrow money for the city to deal with what the startups can't actually do themselves?
What other markets typically do is included in the terms and conditions of the, whatever the permanent or the pilot program is going to be, where they can remove operators that don't meet the standard, rather than having all the operators pay up front.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, one more thing. Most of the questions that you have about what language should be in there, or what terms or conditions you don't yet know, you can include all of that in the RFP. And what other markets tend to do is they authorize someone. So whether it's a commissioner, or whether it's, head of DPW or whatever it is, they authorize that person in the RFP to say, we reserve the right to modify terms and conditions at any point in time during the program.
Okay. Anything to add? If not, who's our motion expert tonight, anyway? I can't motion, can I?
Sure you can.
Oh, I can? Well, I would move that we recommend the RFQ with the modifications for requesting the time period they would be in use for approval to the city commission.
And I second that motion.
All those in favor say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it. Sure. Staff items.
First item is to remind folks of the Safe Routes to School open house that's coming up on November 14th from 6 to 8 at the Douglas County Fairgrounds. So right now we're in the process of making changes and reviewing our Safe Routes to School plan and looking to get public feedback at that meeting. So just wanted to put that plug out there that that's coming up. And second item is just an update on the neighborhood traffic management program. So in May, we approved, the Transportation Commission approved the plan, and we have sent out the RFP for that, received 5 responses. The staff is recommending using Alta Planning and Design, and we are taking their scope and fee to the city commission here pretty soon. So, right, Dustin? Dustin's been working on it, so we're trying. Yeah, we're trying to get that in November. So we got 5 responses, and I think we reviewed all the proposals and had 2 interviews and felt that Alta was the best for the city. So we're trying to get that going as soon as possible as well. So that's good news. And then the only other brief update I have is, I think I said this last month, but next month we'll roll out the iCompass software for agenda items. We tried to get it this month, but just trying to get through all the intricacies of the approval process with that, but that should be new next month. So that's all that we have for staff items.
Okay, any questions? Go ahead, Charlie.
Open house for the safe routes process. Are there actual route changes that are identified that are going to be shared that night, or is it, just tell us more about what the open house might entail?
Yeah. I don't think Jessica's leading it, and she took off, Jessica and Ashley. I think there's a few things we're trying to get input on. One is whether or not we should be looking at shared streets as a potential for future routes. I think for those that are familiar with the 18th Street discussion for Cordley between Tennessee and Louisiana over there, if there are streets that are not feasible to get future sidewalks on, is that a better street than 19th Street? So to get some input on, should a shared street be considered a safe route to school with the appropriate treatment? So that's one thing specific thing we're looking to get feedback on. I think we're going to use that example.
Crossing guards, maybe?
Crossing guards. We're reviewing the crossing guards as well. There's all kinds of different facets to the program, but the crossing guard, we got some data, and we're looking at getting some input on making some changes to that based off of the use of the existing crossing guards. So if there's specific input at any of the schools about the existing locations or maybe future locations, getting some input on that as well.
And also, if we've added infrastructure, do we still need a crossing guard where there's a signal?
Is there a chance that this commission is going to be given to review the changes, or how does that, what's our role in this process?
Yeah, I would expect the plan would come to the Transportation Commission.
I guess I'm looking for is what level of involvement are we kind of expected to have? Are we going to just get a presentation and say yes, or are we going to like look at it and say, what about this route, or what about that? Like, what's our engagement look like? And I think I'm asking that kind of broadly, like not just you, but what are you guys expecting? We've put a lot of attention on safe routes over the years, and certainly we've been careful to think about how we're prioritizing the funding that's available so that it doesn't, that it is balanced and some of it will go to safe routes. So I guess I'd like to know that we're interested in that topic enough that we're going to invest some of our own attention to it. Study session or something. So just looking for what's the thoughts on how we're involved in that process. So.
That's a good question. I don't know specifically anything. I don't know, to be honest with you, Charlie. We're having these open houses to get input at the different schools from the folks they use, the users and the routes. We have different work groups that have been meeting to discuss education and the built environment. And then we want to put together a plan that's something that's an adopted plan that we have. So if there's anything that, as far as policies go in regards to the Safe Routes to School plan that we may need to look at.
I wonder if there's a way for us to be place for the public to be engaged in this work also? Like, when we're talking about updating a plan, how does the public kind of follow that process and know, like Cordley, for example, do we put that on the agenda so that it's not just the entire, Douglas County plan or whatever, it's Cordley's plan is on the agenda tonight, and we expect to hear from people from Cordley. Give us input on this. Let's hear your thoughts on how is this working for you. I mean, this is the second attempt to kind of develop these plans, and I honestly don't feel like there's been a very public process in either case. The last time, which I was involved in, and then this time. I mean, so it feels like this commission has the opportunity to ask for a different level of engagement of the public. And we're providing the funding for a lot of this work, so I'd like to know that it's that the people that use those routes are really eager to see what we're going to spend money on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I just don't know how you direct all that to occur.
Yeah, I don't either.
But
it feels like
haven't-
we have a program that the community supports, that we've been supporting, and it's being, there's a process to review and revise it, and it doesn't seem like we've been involved a whole lot, and I just wonder if that's something we should try to do something about.
Well,
given
would
that,
there be an
you know.
opportunity at this open house to have a board or have a person or?
Well, I think the open house has a purpose already, and I'm not trying to change that purpose. I'm
Yeah.
just pointing out, like, we have a purpose too, and one of the roles we have is to advise the city commission how to invest their resources around transportation, including safe routes.
Mhm.
So what does that look like? And I don't have an answer exactly. I just figure, like, it should be
Mhm.
more than what we just go to an open house.
So if we put something on the agenda regarding safe routes, you're thinking we would get information from the users, the parents and the,
Well, I just wonder what's the public process that involves this space? I'm thinking sometimes, I think Nick has made this comment about soliciting input from particular groups. So if we put on the agenda that tonight is the night we're going to review and make a recommendation on a particular school's plan, would that warrant their interest, their attention, their attendance, and their engagement? Would that be useful for the process of
do
making
we
sure that
treat
we have
each,
plans?
do we treat each school's plan separately, or do we do?
No, we don't. And I think that's kind of would that be a more effective way to engage people? And they're probably going to easily tell us what the highest priority is for their school. And I'm not sure that's something that we can gather from the methodology we've developed. But if I knew that the most important thing for Cordley was this 18th Street issue, that would matter to me. I'd like to know what their highest concern is. And maybe it's 18th, maybe it's actually just crossing 19th Street. Because they have a lot of kids that are walking. And I don't know how many people cross the 19th or if that's an issue for them, but I'd like to know that. And I guess I'm looking for, like, how do we engage the public on a topic that we know the public cares about? And it sounds like the timing is such that it's going to come up soon for the opportunity, maybe, if we're asking for it. So I'm asking, are we asking for it? Like, what are we wanting to do with the Safe Routes process?
And what are we going to do after we get it?
Would it be fair to ask Ron to make some suggestions on part of the school
I'm an
district?
at-large member now. I'm not a representative of UFC 497.
Okay.
Aren't we? No.
You asked for it.
Can I repeat my question? It
Well,
seems like we ought to have a network to connect to the people you're talking about. And, well, somebody happens to be sitting
I
there.
understand. Just teasing.
So,
I'm just teasing. Well, I guess I agree and quasi disagree when we say, when you asked, is the plan, the plan is a comprehensive and cohesive plan, but we do solicit individual, there's an opportunity for this group that knows their neighborhood to give input to the routes around our neighborhood. So it's not, it isn't a separate adventure, but it is separate pieces that are brought together as a nice big puzzle. So, I guess part of it is, I think that there is that opportunity, unlike in a lot of situations where we do solicit and request information from groups at a micro level. But the truth is that the level of engagement at different buildings is, you may have 0 to 1 or 2 people that have come for one building, and you may have 30 people for another school. So I agree with Charlie. That's where trying to draw, solicit that information, and I absolutely understand what he's saying and agree with, this plan's being made at a cellular level, and it's combined, and the city, we're doing these things, and then we are making a lot of very important fiscal decisions based on what this plan says. And, eventually, I guess the city, I don't remember I don't remember what the city commission does, if they just approve the plan, or if they.
Well, it's used when we make funding recommendations.
Right, but what I mean is, when we come up and say, here is the safe route
Yeah.
plan, I can't remember what the city's actual role is, if they just say, we support the plan, or.
I'm not sure.
Well, we would like the school district to approve the plan, the city to approve the plan.
Right.
I don't know if we ever really got there.
As I say, I
No,
don't
and
think.
well, I can tell you.
I don't think we ever got there, but
We
this is
did.
where, like,
Right.
our role, we didn't exist, this commission did not exist when the first Safe Routes Plan was
Right.
developed.
You're right.
Now that we exist, and now that we're making decisions about how we're gonna spend the money that's allocated around ped bike improvements, it feels like we're pretty disconnected to this pretty important issue, or this program. And I just kind of raise it up, like, why are we doing that? Why are we not seeing the opportunity to engage the whole neighborhood that surrounds that school, is impacted by the Safe Routes program in those neighborhoods? The planning process that's underway currently, it's involved a little bit of opportunity for input, but as a parent with 2 kids at Quail Run, I gotta say, I haven't seen any engagement of our school. And we have a poster up for the first time in the 4 or 5 years that shows the routes. I know when that poster, or when the routes have been seen by parents, they've immediately identified questions around, why not this route? And in our walk and bike parades, on the walk to school day and bike to school day, the route we use is not on the map. So it's the one that parents think about as what should be the safest route, because there's no crossing of streets other than Harvard. And it's sort of intuitive to parents, but it's not in the plan. And so I think about that, that's not, no one's at fault there, it's just the lack of engagement. So if parents are engaged, you tend to get better plans, because people have more perspective that gets brought to the table. And without their perspective, we all lose. So how do we maybe use this forum to get deeper engagement so that the plans are better, so the money that's better, is better invested in the community? And when it comes to trying to improve across all the neighborhoods, you can hopefully ascertain what would be the most important investment in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood with the Safe Routes money that we're, trying to very carefully, recommend to the
Does
city
that
commission.
interaction need to start at the school level?
Actually, I think the neighborhoods have a pretty big stake in this. The parents that live around the schools in particular, the neighborhood associations. I think we haven't figured out the magic formula to get engagement. And if you don't have engagement, it's just gonna make planning harder. And you can do your best, but you'll miss things that are sort of obvious when you go, oh yeah, we should have thought that. But, so it's really, how do you get better engagement? So I'm wondering, like, is this a space that allows engagement? We have, neighborhoods that seem to be mobilized for 19th Street. Is there something different that happens when you say Transportation Commission is gonna review and make recommendations on the proposed safe routes plan for Quarterly? People hear that, and they might react, I don't know. This is sort of an experiment. Like, would that cause a reaction more than saying they're gonna consider the Lawrence Safe Routes Plan or the Douglas County Safe Routes Plan? I mean, when I hear Quail Run, I'm gonna go, what, huh? Right, so when I hear Quarterly, someone that is in that neighborhood is gonna be activated in a different way than if they just hear.
As opposed to just hearing safe routes.
Yeah, so just kind of, how do we get to the next level with engagement? The program, the funding that the state has for safe routes, it's been pretty consistent over the years. We're finally, being able to pull down some of those state dollars, match it with our local dollars. So it feels like we just got to keep improving on our efforts. And one question would be, what's our role in that process to improve on our efforts as a community? Because we didn't have this before. And are we just going to wait until the end of the process and then say, yeah, this looks good? Or are we going to maybe be part of the activation of the public? Is there anything we can do differently to improve the plan?
How are the school administrators involved? Is this a topic of discussion with school principals?
Well, not amongst school principals. Most of the groups, or many of the groups that were involved, typically were members of either site councils or PTAs or PTOs within the building. So in that regard, the administrators may have been involved with the discussions, but again, unless the principals, they're not going to be necessarily aware of what's the best route 2.0 miles away from my building, what are the best crossings. They're just not going to necessarily be engaged in that as much, and the parents would.
I think what they're engaged in is managing traffic in front of the building.
Yeah.
During
Getting them
drop-off,
within the block of the building.
Yeah, it's literally the bulk of the issue they're going to focus on is getting kids safely out of cars into the building. And, at Quail Run in particular, from my experience, Chris Tilden sent an email to the principal about a year ago, kind of prompting some discussion about safe routes, and I'm the chair of our site council. So I put it on our site council agenda. It was discussed, and then the principal was going to have a follow-up discussion with Chris about it. I'm the chair of the Safe Routes Committee for our PTO. So I would think that I would hear about anything safe routes related at Quail Run, and I haven't heard much at all. So I think about this effort, as a parent, and now a parent who's serving in ways that I should be more aware. I'm not feeling like there's much engagement at all. And so nothing, I don't want to indicate any or suggest anyone's to blame in that. I think that as a community, we care about the program, and every one of us can kind of imagine what can we do differently to drive better engagement. Parents are busy. You have your kids to deal with, your jobs, whatever. So how do we step into that work and possibly drive more engagement? It's kind of my question. And that's got to be better for everyone. Like, I just can't believe a planner wouldn't want to have more engagement on creating the right plan. And we don't want to spend money on things that aren't really high priorities for these neighborhoods. I don't think. I mean, I know I don't want to. I think we have a nice methodology, but at the end of the day, I still want to know, is this really the deal maker, the difference maker for that school? When you get those parents activated, like Quarterly was a couple years ago, you kind of go, oh, this is what they really care about. They got a street that cars, there's no way to get a sidewalk there. That was the original plan, but it's just not big enough. So, but that's nice to get a school like Quarterly that has a lot of parents that are kind of interested in this issue. Not every school has that. And I'm not sure we'd always get that if we put a thing on the agenda either. I'm just thinking we got to do something maybe.
So just spitballing here, would it be possible to send out to, say, the PTO listserv of each school, for example, a list and drawings of what the proposed safe routes to school projects are, and then say, can you give us your feedback in a month or so? And then based on what those feedback responses are, you might see that some schools don't care, they're fine. And some were way off, you know? So then you could prioritize from there. All right, clearly we have 5 schools that have huge disagreements on what they think are safe routes and what we think, and then perhaps that could be an agenda item. But since there's so many schools, you'll have to prioritize them somehow. So some kind of survey-ish that could be distributed to PTO members could shorten that time span, perhaps.
Can
It might help.
I'm going to jump in. I think they've sent out a parent survey already.
Good, okay.
As the first step. And I think the goal is to take this information from the survey and then information from the open house to help develop the plan priorities for making changes. And I think the intent at this point is not to get into the weeds on every little issue of every school at the open house, but to get some high-level input that would help tailor any changes to the plan. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in it and anyone on the commission to attend on November the 14th. And if there's feedback or input on getting more engagement, we're willing to listen on that. I know the team that's working on it includes folks from the school district, health department, staff. There's a bunch of folks in the room, PD.
Well, this has been a good discussion. I kind of think we need to conclude something, and we can just let it fade, or we can keep it in front of us. I'm going to try to attend this event, and I don't know that we're going to figure this out tonight, Charlie, and I'm not even sure what control the people up here have.
Well, I think
You
it would
know.
be helpful just to clarify what our role is as currently conceived. So
Okay.
if we're going to get us at a study session, that would be helpful to know. If we're going to get it on our regular agenda, that would be helpful to know. And then when that might happen. So as a next step, maybe it's just about getting clarification from Jessica or whoever is leading this effort as to what they conceive of as our role, and then allow us to maybe have some discussion about that. I believe I have confidence in the group that is working on this. I don't want to cast any doubt on them. I was involved in that before, and it was, great work, and I think this community has appreciated that work. And so now here we are, second effort, and I'd just like to have some opportunity to be clear about what our role is going to be in that, and perhaps we could discuss whether that's the role we're wanting to have, or if we have another perspective on how that role might play out.
Well, we're probably looking at something after the first of the year. My instincts would say to make it an agenda item, to give it some, and get the public more in tune. And maybe Ron could help with some communication to groups who might attend that meeting and provide some input.
I know Lan was interested in it back in the day, so
Well,
that's
yeah,
another one to.
Land crossed my mind a few times tonight, too.
I think we could put together a report on the process for the next meeting to give everyone an update, so it's kind of clear where we're at, where we're going, and then take into consideration an agenda item early next year and provide
And some kind of a status, what we've accomplished so far.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. That's a big deal.
Honestly, I think it's a great thing.
Mhm.
I was there back, Chuck was there. I remember the school district tried and didn't get a grant from KDOT, and that discouraged them. After the second time, it was kind of like, well, I guess this isn't going to happen. And then it was kind of, let's get together and really figure this out. And we did, and it got us going again. And then here we are, years later, and it feels like this community is a champion of safe routes.
Right, good.
And I think we stand out in Kansas for that. So let's just keep, making it better.
Great. Well, we have some next steps here, so. All righty, let's move on to commission items. Nick Petak.
We had a canceled meeting last month, so there's nothing to report.
Now, come on.
I mean, we're still, so they closed the search for the new transit director, so presumably interviews will be happening soon. So.
They
we'll see.
closed the search, so
Yeah.
that means,
So now they've moved from trying to find people to, they found a couple of people and trying to figure out who's the right fit, so.
wow, okay.
So it's happening.
Okay. Thank
But
you. That's
otherwise,
exciting.
the transit center is still in limbo just because there's a lot of complicated legal and land issues that have to happen with KU and probably the state before we go forward, so. That's it.
Well, good. Carol, did you have a commission item?
Actually, some observations. My first is on medical services in Lawrence. Towns tend to do one of two things. They either develop a mega complex and they buy up all the real estate around the hospital, or they have dispersed facilities around town, which seems to be what we are doing, and that creates transportation problems. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. I don't know if that's something the T should get into, or Uber, or whoever, but you know, you get a lab here, you go to doctor there, whatever. I can see that becoming a problem. I think we need to look at our complete streets policy and maybe update it a little bit, put something in there about retrofitting. I think we need to have some protocol on email practices. We got an email from someone by the name of Margaret. And normally, if I don't know who the person is, I won't even open it. And so maybe on the website where it has our email addresses, we could put at least, please put your name and address down so that we know that you're a real person. I used to tell my students, if your email address is cutiepie@hotmail.com, I am not going to open it. Make sure you say something about college algebra, or, you know, give me a clue on what we're going to talk about if I'm going to open it. And I think we really need to be more careful with that. And then here's one. Every time the sidewalk issue comes up in the news, I grieve for the staff. They put up with a lot of heat. And the misconceptions out there never quit, even during the campaign. They just never quit. So I was trying, you know, last time I was supporting the community and all this and that. This time I'm supporting staff. As an example, I think that we could bring forward the state law on sidewalks. We all know what it is. We all know that almost every state, probably not Alaska, has a law that the property owner is responsible for the sidewalks. I'd like to see it and understand it and why we have that law. Then the other thing that was thrown into the mix, right about the time the task force was looking at all this, was the state put a cap on property taxes. And so there is no wiggle room in the budget. And the community feels frustrated. The staff is frustrated. They really want to do all these things, but they can't pay for it. So I was thinking that we should also investigate the cap on the property tax. I'm guessing that we could almost put some kind of a, whatever it is you vote on, to designate a millage for sidewalks. And then every property owner would be responsible. But, you know, I'm always thinking pie in the sky, but I think we could do we could at least study the issue so that when people approach us, we can say, well, liability this and, you know, whatever. I'd like to hear that.
Thank you. You guys know all these things, right?
They're all on the.
No, I mean that, really.
No, yeah, they are. They're on the,
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
I think they were in the minutes last time.
Anybody else? Are we tired yet, or?
Please vote tomorrow,
Oh, that's true.
Unless you've already voted.
unless you've already voted. Then thank you for your vote.
Or unless you want to waive your right to complain. Sorry. If you don't vote, you don't get to complain. That's my mantra.
If only that was true.
I just won't listen to it.
I say that honestly because Carol's comments made me think, you know, the current approach to the sidewalk hazard policy, you know, it's really enforcing the state law and the local ordinance. And there's funding that was set aside to help with that policy, and that was certainly an item of everyone's campaign, so things could be changing.
I'm thinking that after tomorrow, we'll know a lot more where the discussion about sidewalks is going to go. And I'd be surprised if it was ended tomorrow. So, and I'm certainly thinking it may end up back at this table in the future too. So, should we move on to calendar items?
Next month, at the study session that we were going to talk about last month on Chapter 20, Article 9. That's an update from our planning department staff. And then on a regular meeting, the Castled 22nd to Clinton Parkway Design Review, which we thought about putting on tonight, but I thought better of it and said, let's just move it till December.
Thanks.
In addition, start thinking about next year. Last year in December, we started thinking about calendar of dates and getting our meetings on the calendar for next year. And then getting a subcommittee, if desired, on planning the annual retreat. Typically, we like to have some members of the Transportation Commission help staff with planning the retreat. So those are the two things that we have at this point. And we will try to get an update on Safe Routes to School. May just be a staff item.
In December, you want to talk about the committee for the annual.
Yeah.
Okay. And not too far after that, we'd be looking at a new chair and vice chair.
Whose turn?
January.
Is it
In
January?
January.
I thought that was like March or April.
Nope.
Oh, they
Yeah,
January.
we may have done it February last year. I can't remember. I'm thinking we didn't have a January meeting. We did in February, but
We did.
Right.
the intention's the first month of the year, first meeting of the year, I'd say.
Well, I know that I was named the chair before our retreat,
You were?
Mm-hmm.
because I came to the retreat with some prepared
Oh, yeah.
information. So, and I think that's a good idea to do that. So if we can make all that timing work,
Yeah.
I think it would be good.
I think last year we did the retreat in February.
I think that's how
The
it
year
worked.
before, the first one was in January, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
We'll probably shoot for the same time frame with this one.
yeah.
Does,
I would probably vote to have the January meeting and then have the retreat in February and skip the February meeting if we needed to.
are we gonna have new people in January? Like, whose term is ending? Ron? Just Ron?
Ron,
There's like three of us that are in the mix.
yeah, it's online. I can't remember. I was thinking it was Catherine, but I think we just reappointed her.
Well,
Yeah.
you did update the
John,
list,
it's
so it's
John, Aaron,
accurate.
and Ron,
Yeah.
right?
What's online still shows the representation of your agency
Yeah,
So,
that hasn't changed.
Oh, it
On
does.
the webpage?
on the webpage, yeah.
I thought we revised, it got revised, and then we changed the name from Transportation Commission to Multimodal, and then all the old stuff popped back up, so I asked them
I looked at it
last
today, it
week.
still showed it.
And sometimes you need to, I also found out you need to refresh a couple of times, because they've changed things, and I said, no, you didn't, and they said, well, just refresh,
Alright.
so we'll check it again, make sure it's accurate.
All right.
I think we're ready to adjourn. Will 19th Street go to the City Commission next week?
Not next week.
Probably before Thanksgiving then?
I'm not sure.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah, as soon as we can put together the agenda item and
Okay.
the day that it fits best on the
Okay.
agenda, yeah.
Good.
We don't want to
Alrighty.
wait.
We may be adjourned.
So moved.
Thanks a lot.
Aye.